Before the first cities, before writing or metal, people built homes, carved stones, and crossed seas on lands that no longer exist. Many of those places now lie buried under soil, sand, or water, traces of whole worlds washed away by time and flood. This story follows the remains of those forgotten civilizations, built long before recorded history, showing how humans lived, adapted, and began everything we know today. Ohalo II, Sea of Galilee near 23,000 BCE. The surface of the Sea of Galilee is calm today, but more than 20,000 years ago, its shores looked very different. The waterline was lower, the air colder, and small groups of humans made their lives along this ancient lake. On one small patch of ground, later swallowed by the rising water, a community left behind one of the most complete snapshots of Ice Age life ever found. That place is Ohalo II. When archaeologists first uncovered the site, they found the faint outlines of brush huts pressed into ancient mud. Each hut was oval, built from branches of tamarisk and oak, then covered with reeds and grasses. They were simple shelters, sunk slightly into the earth, large enough for a small family. Around them lay the traces of hearths, a grave, and piles of stone flakes. 6 huts in all, arranged along the lake's edge, formed a small but organised camp. Soon after these people left, the lake rose. Mud and water sealed the village away, locking it in time for more than 20 millennia. Inside the best-preserved hut, a flat grinding stone sat near the northern wall. Around it lay thousands of tiny seeds. It wasn't a random scatter. The seeds formed a curve, as if someone had knelt there, spreading handfuls of grain while crushing them into flour. This single moment, frozen in the soil, shows that the people of Ohalo II were not only gathering wild plants, but processing them. Long before farming began, they were already experimenting with the tools and habits that would one day define agriculture. Across the camp, small flint blades lay scattered. Some had microscopic polish along their edges, the kind produced by cutting grasses and cereals. Others were freshly knapped, showing that stone tools were made right there beside the huts. The people chose local flint, shaping it into slender points, scrapers, and sickle-like edges. The same area also yielded wooden tools, rare survivors from this age, shaped and carved with care. A few were notched, others sharpened, suggesting they were used for digging or cutting soft material. Their preservation was a gift of the mud that entombed them. What truly sets Ohalo II apart is its extraordinary collection of plants. More than 90,000 seeds were recovered, a record unmatched for a site this old. Barley, wheat relatives, millet, legumes, and fruits. Even tiny seeds of wild berries and grapes. The sheer variety shows that the people understood the land in detail. They knew when different plants ripened, how to gather them, and where to find the most nutritious ones. Around their huts, soil samples revealed patches of wild cereal weeds, species that thrive in disturbed ground. It means their camp had already begun to change the environment. Simply by living there, they created small human landscapes in a world still ruled by nature. Animal remains add another layer to the picture. Bones of gazelle, deer, hare, fox, tortoise, and fish lay scattered among the hearths. These people were not dependent on a single source of food. They hunted, fished, gathered, roasted, and ground whatever the landscape provided. Fish vertebrae show cut marks, proof of filleting. Burned shells of nuts and seeds reveal roasting. In a single layer of ash, you can see the rhythm of their days, catching fish at the lakeshore, processing plants inside the huts, resting near the fires as night fell over the valley. The site's dating tells us they lived here around 23,000 years ago, near the end of the last glacial maximum. The climate was harsh. Winters were cold and dry, but the freshwater lake created a narrow belt of life. That shoreline was rich in reeds, birds, and edible plants. Ohalo II's people took advantage of that abundance, returning season after season. The hearths were rebuilt in the same places, showing continuity and perhaps a sense of ownership, an early hint of sedentism. Among the finds was a human grave, the burial of an adult male lying beside a hut wall. His body was placed with care, suggesting social awareness and respect for the dead. Near him were beads made from small shells, possibly sewn onto clothing. These ornaments tell us that aesthetics and symbolism were already part of daily life. Archaeologists have since mapped every seed, every flake, every bone fragment. When you step back and look at the pattern, it reveals a structured society. There were areas for cooking, tool-making, plant processing, and sleeping. This was not a random camp of wanderers. It was a community that planned its space, organised its work, and used its environment efficiently. In their world, survival depended on knowing exactly when to harvest, where to fish, and how to build shelter against the wind. What makes Ohalo II such a vital discovery is how much of it survived. The rising waters that might have erased their camp instead preserved it better than any open-air site from the Ice Age. The lake sealed the huts under a blanket of silt, shutting out air and bacteria. Wood, fibres, seeds, even footprints in the mud, all remained intact. It's as if time stopped the moment they left. Each artifact from Ohalo II adds a piece to the puzzle of how humans bridged the gap between foraging and farming. The grinding stones, the charred cereals, the polished blades. Together they show that the shift toward agriculture didn't begin suddenly in the Neolithic. It began here, in small steps, with people who already understood how to shape nature to their needs. Standing at the water's edge today, it's hard to imagine the life that once pulsed beneath those waves. But under the silt lies the memory of one of humanity's earliest settled communities. They built, they cooked, they planned, and they left behind the quiet evidence of a world on the verge of change. Natufian culture, Levant 12,500 or 9,500 BCE. Imagine a gentle valley rimmed by forest and grass, somewhere in what is now the Levant, at a time when the Ice Age had loosened its grip and the landscape was changing beneath human feet. Here, between about 12 and 9,000 years before our era, a people known to archaeologists as the Natufians made their home. They were still hunter-gatherers, yet something in their lives was shifting. They built more permanent houses, returned to the same places season after season, and managed the land in ways that point toward the future of farming. In one settlement deep in the Hula Valley, stones defined circular walls excavated into earth. Imagine a family stepping inside one of those low sunken dwellings, corners smoothed by generations of use. The floors were often plastered, hearths sat in the centre, and around the edges you find tools for grinding, for cutting, for storing. Outside, the forest stretched to the hills. Wild cereal grasses grew beneath the trees. Gazelles grazed in the open. Water flowed nearby. This village was rooted, not just a passing camp. On any given morning, the people would awaken in their semi-subterranean huts. Roofs of branches and hide filtered the light, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through. Some of the eldest might pick up a microlithic blade, a small flint tool sharpened meticulously, set into a handle of bone or wood. With it they would harvest wild cereal stalks, rye, barley, wheat relatives, from stands near the settlement. The blades often show polish from slicing grasses, proof that gathering wasn't simply random but organised. Meanwhile, the younger hunters might head out with spears or nets, tracking mountain gazelle, hare, tortoise, or diving for freshwater fish. Back at the hearth, an area of the wall might store stones used for grinding, and fragments of shell beads or bone pendants lie nearby. Someone is grinding dehusked wild grains into coarse meal. Someone else is roasting nuts or fruit. Others are repairing tools or creating ornaments. In the arboreal belt around them, oak and pistachio trees granted nuts. Wild olives and almonds clustered where humans and forest met. The diversity of the landscape offered more than survival. It invited innovation. The houses were not purely temporary shelters. Some dwellings remain in place for decades. In the early phase of this culture, we see large stone-faced walls and dense clusters of houses, implying a community that returned to the same place year after year. Seasonal movements were reduced. The home base became a constant. This semi-sedentary lifestyle meant that children grew up in the same place. Memories were layered in the dirt and social bonds deepened. Burials found inside houses show that the dead were sometimes laid to rest beneath the floor, near hearths, among the living's memories. This sign of place and remembrance marks a shift in how the land was viewed. Around the camp you could walk through the grasses and notice slight furrows or patches where wild cereals had been disturbed. Some scholars believe that by tending stands of wild grains, clearing brush, returning to the same plots, these people may have indirectly encouraged the plants they wanted. They were edging toward cultivation even as they remained mobile enough to follow game and seasonal foods. It was a delicate balance. Favour enough permanence to tend the land, yet enough mobility to exploit rich foraging zones. The climate of the time aided this story. As the Pleistocene glaciation gave way, the forest steppe belt of the Levant expanded. Wild grasses flourished, nuts were abundant, animals remained plentiful. But then sudden shifts came. At the end of the Younger Dryas, things became colder and drier. The Natufians had to adapt. Some sites show reduced permanence, some widening of diet to include more varied animals and plants. Their world changed, and so did their strategies. One such community, situated on a lakeshore terrace, shows fish bones mixed with the bones of gazelle and deer, stone mortars intermingled with tiny flint bladelets and shell beads. The lake's edge offered fish, waterfowl, reeds for mats, wood for roofing. The hills offered game and nuts. The mingling of environments gave the Natufians a rich mosaic of possibilities. They were no longer purely forest hunters nor open plain gatherers, but something in between, using multiple habitats. In crafting their everyday world, the Natufians left hand axes, groundstone bowls, flint sickle blades, bone awls and personal ornaments. Some houses contain dozens of beads and carved items. These are not marks of mere survival, they suggest social complexity, craft specialization, and imagination. Children likely played games, perhaps hunted small animals, learned tool-making from elders, and saw the seasons return again and again along the same shores. Hunting still played a major role. Mountain gazelles dominated their faunal remains, but turtles, tortoises, fish, hares also appear. Gathering remained central. Wild grains, legumes, nuts, fruits. At times, the intensification of plant use is evident. Cutting tools, sickle gloss on blades, grinding stones show repeated processing of plant foods. The evidence suggests they were deeply familiar with the land's rhythms, knowing which plants ripened which month, when game passed through, when fish were abundant. As seasons turned, families may have moved lightly, perhaps into caves or higher ground in summer, returning to the base settlement in winter. In other cases, the base settlement itself was permanent and supported year-round living. The result? A shifting rhythm of mobility and rootedness that defined this era. At the heart of their world, the landscape mattered. The hills were forested, the woodlands were rich, the valley lowlands watered by springs, streams carved through rocks, feeding pools of fish. Nuts dropped in the autumn, wild cereals ripened on the valley floor. The Natufians positioned themselves at the convergence of these zones. They built their world where water, wood, grass, and game intersected. Their houses, hearths, ornaments, tools all tell the story of people living between worlds, between the pure hunting-gathering of the deep past and the full farming villages of the years to come. The landscape shaped them, and they in turn shaped the landscape. They cleared, they planted, they returned. They were not yet farmers, but they were no longer purely roamers. Every groundstone, every flint blade, every bead buried with the dead serves as evidence of this transitional life. The bread-like substances made from wild cereals may be the earliest on record. Dogs appear beside human graves. Social bonds fixed in dwellings ground into the same earth year after year. The Natufian world was a threshold built on landscapes rich and changing. And in their everyday acts, harvesting grasses, repairing huts, grinding grain, sharing meals around hearths, these people quietly prepared the path for what humans would soon become. Settlers of villages, cultivators of land, builders of long-term homes, the valley, the forest, the lake. They were here before full farming, and these people shaped a new way of life rooted in place. Göbekli Tepe, SE Turkey, around 9,600 to 8,200 BCE. A hill rising above the plains of southeastern Anatolia hides stones that were shaped by hands long gone, hands that carved, hoisted and aligned monolithic pillars more than 11,000 years ago. On that ridge lie the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, a place where hunter-gatherers paused long enough to build something extraordinary. This is the story of how it was discovered, how it was built, and what the stones tell us. From the first survey of the site in the 1960s to the deeper excavations beginning in the 1990s, archaeologists have treated Göbekli Tepe like the pages of a handwritten diary, uncovering layer after layer of human intention. In 1994, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived at the site and recognized the curved stone slabs as more than rock piles. They were carved pillars, circles of stone erected by people without pottery, without domesticated crops, perhaps without settled farming. Excavation began, and soon after the first of the giant T-shaped limestone pillars emerged from the soil. Over the following seasons, work crews uncovered massive stone enclosures, each one built atop a rocky plateau overlooking the plains. They discovered quarries, channels carved in bedrock for rainwater collection, tool workshops and countless flint tools lying in the fill. The dig diary records sweat, labour, unexpected finds, a human grave rush, collapsed pillars, rubble deliberately backfilled, and the slow peeling away of time. As each layer was removed, the evidence ledger grew. The site dates to around 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans were still mobile, yet here they built for the long term. In the deepest constructions, sometimes called Layer 3, the circular enclosures were built roughly 11,000 years ago. The central feature of each circle, two tall T-shaped pillars, 4 to 5.5 meters high, carved from bedrock on the hill itself, then dragged and stood upright. Surrounding them, smaller T-pillars formed rings. The stone circles measure up to 20 m in diameter. These monoliths are the oldest known megaliths in the world. The pillars themselves bear carved arms, hands, belts, loincloths, human forms stylized in stone. On their faces and on many adjacent pillars, reliefs of animals, foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, gazelle. Some pillars weigh more than 15 tons. The quarry marks remain visible. One moment you're reading the dig diary of extraction, pick marks in limestone bedrock, waste flakes still beside them. Then you are reading the ledger of symbolic meaning. The carvings invite fascination. Many archaeologists read the T-shapes as anthropomorphic. They are human figures in stone, standing sentinel in the circles. Others see them as ancestors, gods, or symbolic guardians. In addition to the pillars, the site showcases a suite of tools and features that hint at everyday life. Flint artifacts are abundant. Cores, bladelets, scrapers and burins scattered in enormous numbers. Grinding stones, often resting beside walls, suggest cereal processing. Phytoliths from wild wheat and barley appear. Rainwater runoff channels carved in the bedrock drained into cisterns that could hold over 100 cubic meters of water, indicating planned infrastructure. Some of the enclosures show entrance passages and benches. Some areas appear to be workspaces, some perhaps ritual spaces. The evidence ledger includes domestic elements, hearths, ovens, pits filled with animal bone, flint debitage fields, all of it stacked in the deposit layers. Faunal remains tell another piece of the story. The bones of wild animals, gazelle, aurochs, boar, deer, lie in refuse pits adjacent to the stone circles. Seasonality studies show some animals arriving in the landscape only at certain times of year. The site may have served gatherings of mobile groups who came together for feasting or ritual, exploiting wild resources. But beyond feasting, the presence of heavy architecture shows communal labour and organisation far beyond what we would expect from simple wanderers. Every cut mark, every polished edge, every carved relief contributes to a ledger of human behaviour. One pillar, referred to as Pillar 43, shows a vulture over a headless man with an erect phallus, complex symbolism whose full meaning escapes the present. But its presence makes clear that these people were thinking about identity, about imagery, about transformation. The better preserved enclosures show bench seating in stone so that people could gather facing the pillars. The enclosures were roofed in their prime with burnt lime floors, terrazzo surfaces, found in some contexts. The built environment was not just open air, but sheltered, substantial. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone plateau and overlooks the Harran Plain and the headwaters of the Balik River. That location was chosen for vantage, for access to flint and limestone bedrock, for visibility. The natural environment around was open, steppe grassland rich in wild cereals and grazers, not forested. Most fuel charcoal found is pistachio or almond wood, indicating the vegetation. In the dig diary one sees seasons of work, extraction of raw stone, setting up camp, carving the pillars, raising them, decorating them, using them, eventually a deliberate and gradual backfilling of the buildings. By around 8,200 BCE, the monumental enclosures were buried, deliberately or due to collapse, and new, smaller domestic buildings rose around. The significance of Göbekli Tepe lies in those records. Architecture built by hunter-gatherers, organisation of labour before agriculture, symbol systems before pottery. The evidence ledger shows that these people used the tools of the wild, flint, wild cereals, large game, and yet engaged in big construction projects. They processed wild cereals, they built dwellings alongside monumental circles, they gathered stone from quarries and raised pillars that weighed many tons. They carved animals and human forms, creating a landscape of meaning. The dig diary and evidence ledger together tell us that Göbekli Tepe was at the edge of transformation, a place where foraging, architecture, and spirituality merged in new ways. Walking among the circle of pillars today, one senses the ancient hands that carved these forms, that hauled them upright, that sat upon benches and looked at reliefs of foxes and vultures illuminated by torchlight. The site records not just stone and tool, but the rhythm of a community thinking itself into permanence. Building, marking, gathering, those pillars remain as ledger entries of human ambition and belief, of precision, of labour, and of vision at the dawn of settled life. Karahan Tepe and the Tas Tepeler network, SE Turkey, 10th to 9th millennia BCE. The hilltops of southeastern Anatolia rise above the plains like silent witnesses to age-old gatherings of humankind. One of these hills, near the Tek Tek Mountains in what is today Sanliurfa province, holds the remains of a remarkable site, Karahan Tepe. To understand this place, we must first lay out the map of its world, a landscape of stone, steppe, and ritual that changed how we think about the dawn of settlement. Picture a high plateau perched at about 690 metres above sea level looking east over rolling limestone terrain. Around this plateau lies a terrain of valleys that funnel water, of flint-bearing bedrock, of wild grasses and animals. The site sits roughly 46 kilometres east of the famous Göbekli Tepe, but what the map reveals is not just distance. It shows a network of sites, the so-called Tas Tepeler stone hills, each with similar architectural ambition and symbolic expression. These hills stretch across the horizon of Upper Mesopotamia, bridging the Euphrates headwaters, the Harran Plain, and the uplands of the Tek Tek Range. On the map you also see raw material traces, limestone outcrops, local flint sources, spring water channels. Karahan Tepe occupies a vantage point. You could see the valley, you had material nearby, you had visibility and a natural defensible height. In the map room we understand not only the structures, but the geography that made them possible. Now move from the map to the stones themselves. The site covers roughly 10 hectares, with up to 5 additional hectares for quarry areas. Excavation has only begun in earnest, just a small percentage of it so far. But what we do know already populates the evidence ledger with astonishing entries. The date of occupation falls into the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B periods, in some estimates around 10,000 to 9,500 BCE, possibly even older. What this means is people were building massive stone enclosures long before widespread farming, maybe while still hunter-gatherers. The ledger opens with architectural elements. Dozens of T-shaped pillars carved from bedrock in situ, some still attached to their original limestone, others erected upright. More than 260 such pillars have been counted. These pillars stand 4 to 5, even up to 6 meters high in some cases. Each is stylized. They have shoulders, arms carved across the chest, belt lines, and many bas-reliefs of animals or abstract motifs. Among the reliefs are snakes, birds, leopards, donkeys, perhaps even human faces. One recent find features a T-pillar with a carved human face, the first of its kind at this site network. The ledger continues with toolkits and small finds, massive densities of flint debitage, over 50 pieces per square metre in some areas, show stone tool manufacture on a grand scale. Chisels, adzes made of river pebble, grindstones, pestles and beads. These all point to a community working not just for immediate subsistence, but craft and symbolic production. Animal motifs abound, donkey reliefs, snake carvings, vulture figures, indicating rich symbolic worlds long before conventional village life. Also in the ledger, hydrological features. Carved channels, cistern-like hollows, carved bedrock reservoir systems, about 500 metres north of the main enclosures, hint at skilled water management. In a time when seasonal rain dominated, to capture and direct water was a major feat. This fact underscores the scale of the venture. This was not just a small isolated camp, but a sighting of investment in place and labour. Diet and subsistence show up too. Although conventional evidence of domesticated crops remains minimal or absent in early layers, the presence of wild cereals, nuts, and large game bones indicates that the inhabitants exploited a rich mosaic of resources. Their settlement lies at the intersection of steppe, hills, and alluvial plain. Game grazed the plain, wild grasses grew on slopes, water flowed in valleys. These people hunted, gathered, processed wild plants, and yet organised themselves in monumental architecture. The evidence ledger thereby forces a re-evaluation, monumental social effort before full-scale farming. Then we have the spatial organisation, enclosures lined by pillars, benches carved along walls, central pillars standing like sentinels, side spaces for tool manufacture and deposit. The fact that quarry marks remain on the bedrock near the pillars shows that the extraction happened on site. Some pillars are unfinished, still partly attached to the rock. They tell a story of invention in process, of extraction, shaping, raising. We can imagine teams of people dragging the stone, erecting it, carving it, then using it. That process required coordination, planning, labour. The ledger records more than tools and stone, it records intention. The network of Tastepla itself amplifies this significance. Karahan Tepe is one node in a constellation of at least a dozen hills with T-shaped pillars and monumental enclosures dating to the 10th-9th millennia BCE. These sites span the same terrain, share toolkits, symbol sets, geological materials. When you place them on the map, you see lines of connectivity, trails between hills, raw material flows from quarries to building sites, seasonal movements of people across ridge and plain. The architecture is shared, the reliefs echo across sites, the lithics follow similar traditions. The ledger records that this was not an isolated experiment, but part of a broader regional phenomenon of monumental social investment and symbolic expression. It is worth noting that despite the scale of the architecture and the deliberateness of the settlement, conventional markers of agriculture, ploughs, field systems, domesticated seedbeds, are either minimal or delayed. That gap between monumental construction and farming is one of the ledger's deep puzzles. It suggests that for a period of many centuries, people organised large gatherings, built big, carved meaning into stone, even as they maintained wild resource economies. All these entries, pillars, water systems, high-density tool manufacture, animal carvings, regional network ties, fill the ledger of Karahan Tepe. The map laid out the geography. The ledger records what humans built, used, and thought. On that plateau, people of the pre-pottery Neolithic built stone monuments, vehicles of meaning, in the landscape that gave them stone and water, flint and grass. Their world is written in the ledger of finds, but the map reminds us that they built with respect to terrain, raw materials, visibility and mobility. Doggerland, North Sea Plain, Mesolithic. Imagine the North Sea not as a stretch of open water, but as a vast lowland plain, forests, rivers, marshes, lakes, where people, animals and plants thrive together. This submerged landmass we now call Doggerland sat between what is now eastern England and the European continent. On a map it stretched from the coast of Britain past the Netherlands and Germany to Denmark. It was once dry, alive, connected. In the early Holocene, the sea level was much lower because the great ice sheets had not yet fully melted. The land between Britain and mainland Europe lay exposed. Rivers drained across it. Bands of forest and wetland grew. Herds of deer, wild cattle and elk roamed. Fish swam in now submerged channels. Wetlands teemed with birds, marsh plants, reeds. Hunter-gatherer groups found rich resources here. Archaeological and seafloor mapping work show that this lost landscape existed and was inhabited. If you zoom in on the map, you find large features, an upland zone known today as the Dogger Bank, faint ridges and valleys under the seafloor, ancient river channels that drained the plain. One such river system, called the Schotten River by researchers, flowed across the plain. The topography shows shallow hills, lowlands, floodplains. Some areas were only a few meters above the then sea level. Standing on a crest, you could see lakes shimmering, grassland spreading, woods behind. The map of Doggerland is now being reconstructed with 3D seismic data and marine cores, revealing the skeleton of a land that once existed. Now, shift into the catastrophe lens. How did this land vanish? As the last ice age ended, the climate warmed and the ice sheets began melting. Sea levels rose, gradually but relentlessly. The low plains of Doggerland were vulnerable. As the water came in, lakes turned saline, marshes spread, rivers backed up, wetlands drowned. First the fringes were lost. Low marsh benches along coasts became tidal flats. The fresh world of meadow and forest gave way to sea. Over centuries the land shrank. By around 5000 BCE, the last islands were disappearing. In effect, the people living there saw their world transform under rising seas. Archaeological evidence shows tools, bones and peat found by fishermen dragged up from the North Sea floor. Antler harpoons, flint blades, peat containing freshwater plants, each a clue that this was once dry land inhabited by humans. That evidence builds a ledger of catastrophe. First the environment changed, then the land disappeared. One episode often considered is the submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide. Around 8,200 years ago, the slide triggered a tsunami across the North Sea basin. Some researchers argue that this wave inundated the low-lying remnant of Doggerland, accelerating the flooding and forcing human groups to move. The map of the landscape shows submerged ridges and paleo-channels that would have directed water and waves, making the catastrophe plausible. But it wasn't only sudden waves. The long-term rise of the sea gradually shifted coastlines inward. Flat plains turned to mudflats, then to tidal marsh, then to open sea. The vegetation changed. Forest retreated, swamps appeared, the rich hunting grounds were lost. People adapted, moved, retreated to rising highlands. In the catastrophe lens, you imagine a landscape shrinking by the year. One year the camp is near a lake. The next year the waves lap closer. The next year the camp is abandoned and the water creeps in. On the map you might trace ancient camps now buried beneath sediment. One model shows Doggerland had an area of roughly 23,000 square kilometres at its height. The waterways of the Rhine, Thames, Scheldt and others drained into this plain before flowing to the Atlantic. The map of rivers, lakes and marshes under the seafloor was once a live world. As sea level came up, the plain transformed. People who hunted elk, deer, wild cattle, fished in rivers, gathered nuts and roots found their habitat gradually vanishing. Coastal camps became inland camps. Some of the last refugees were on the higher ground of the Dogger Bank, until eventually even those were lost. The catastrophe lens reveals how this story relates to human adaptation. As sea rose, resources shifted. Fresh water turned brackish, trees died, game migrated. People had to move, change diets, move camps, or become refugees in their own land. Evidence from cores shows changing pollen records, peat layers, drowned forest remains, trees once standing, now submerged. Archaeologists use that data as a ledger of what was lost. Flints and bone tool fragments come from marine dredges. They tell of human presence in a place now under tens of meters of water. They are silent witnesses of the catastrophe. If you imagine standing on a rising shore of Doggerland some 8,500 years ago, you might hear the wind in the reeds, see water creeping into the marshes, see camps abandoned. The ancient humans there might have sensed the change. Lakes replacing meadows, salt water where fresh had been. They might have moved their hearths, then moved again. Eventually they left the plain altogether for higher ground, leaving behind the tools, bones and trackways now buried under the sea. Today scientists map that vanished land with sophisticated tools. They use seismic surveys originally made for oil exploration, sediment cores dragged from the seabed, and subsea drones. Each map reveals depressions, channels, ridges. Each core reveals plant pollen, insect remains, and bone fragments. The catastrophe lens in this chapter uses that data to show how the story of Doggerland went from thriving land to submerged memory. The map and the ledger combine. The map shows what once existed. The ledger shows what was lost and how. In the story of ancient civilization, this place matters because it reminds us that even large land masses can disappear underwater, that human communities once thrived where now is sea, and that the rising waves of climate and geography have always shaped human history. In the sunken plain beneath the North Sea lie the traces of forests, rivers, peoples, and the memory of a catastrophe that unfolded over centuries. Atlit Yam off Israel, around 6,900 to 6,300 BCE. Think of a shoreline now hidden beneath the sea. A village once stood where today only water ripples. Off the Carmel coast of Israel lies Atlit Yam, a Neolithic settlement now lying 8 to 12 metres under the Mediterranean waves. But long ago, this was dry land, home to people who built houses, dug wells, buried their dead, fished from the shore and farmed wild grains. In the first phase of our story, the catastrophe lens, sea levels were rising. At Atlit Yam, the shoreline of the early Holocene was farther out. The settlement lay near springs and woodland, and yet year by year the sea crept closer. Underwater archaeologists found a deep stone-lined well, used by the villagers when fresh water flowed freely. But as saline water crept into aquifers and the sea surmounted land, that well slowly became unusable. Gradual marine transgression turned fertile land into marshes, then into open water. At one moment people fetched water, the next year the shoreline was shifting. On top of that, some evidence suggests a sudden wave event, a tsunami perhaps from regional volcanic or tectonic activity near 8,500 years ago. Large piles of fish remains, houses abandoned and sealed underwater, hinted a settlement left in haste. In that shifting boundary between land and sea, Atlit Yam captures a moment when a community faced nature's transformations. Now we move into the dig diary, opening the excavation archive. The site was first located in the 1980s by marine archaeologists who found submerged remains off the coast near Atlit. Divers discovered rectangular stone-walled houses on the seabed, hearths, water wells and grave pits. The settlement covers around 6 hectares and lies roughly 300, 400 metres offshore today, buried under 8 to 12 metres of water. Radiocarbon dates place the village's occupation roughly between 6,900 and 6,300 BCE, a relatively short phase of use before submersion. Inside the houses, archaeologists found stone benches, built walls, grinding tools and great numbers of flint artefacts, all indicating that these were permanent or semi-permanent dwellings. One remarkable feature, the stone-lined well. It measures over 5 metres deep, built of dry stones and capped by large slabs. It tapped a freshwater aquifer beneath the ground. The well now lies underwater, but when in use it would have supplied the settlement with water. The fact that it was constructed with care shows the community expected to stay in place for some time. The faunal and botanical remains are rich. At this site, archaeologists recovered remains of wild grains, grapes, nuts, fish bones and shellfish. Alongside the hunting of deer and other land mammals, the people also exploited the sea. Piles of fish bones appear in refuse areas, suggesting that the village had established a mixed economy, fishing, gathering and early cultivation. Some human burials were found inside and near houses. Skeletons show signs of disease and activity. One of the earliest confirmed cases of tuberculosis was identified in a woman and child buried there. These burials provide intimate insight into the lives of these people. Stone megaliths and circular arrangements around springs hint at ritual use of water and landscape. At Atlit Yam, divers found a semicircle of 7 stone pillars around a freshwater spring, suggesting that the community marked this spot as significant. The layout of houses and the orientation of the settlement show that architecture and symbolic space were already part of daily life at this coastal village. The dig diary records the discovery of hearths, post holes, storage pits and tools in place, an intact snapshot of Neolithic life. But the ledger of catastrophe continues. Deeper sediment layers reveal that as the sea rose, the village's fresh water well became contaminated by salt water. Archaeologists found marine shells inside the fill of the well and evidence of refuse deposition above the water table. This suggests the community may have abandoned the well when it no longer produced fresh water. Indeed, by around 6,300 BCE, the village appears to have been left behind, and the rising Mediterranean brought waves and tides into the rooms that had once held families. The transition from dry land to seabed gives us a rare view of how climate and sea level change affected human settlement. On a dive survey mapping the site, teams measured the houses, the well, the stone circle, and recorded sediment layers above the floor surfaces. They noted that some hearths had been sealed by fine silt carried in by rising tides. Some fishhooks, nets, and stone axes lay in place as if the people had simply walked away or fled. The dig diary logs the moment when domestic life ended and submersion began. Each artifact in place, each tool abandoned, each shell embedded in the mud is a line in the ledger of what happened. The environment the villagers inhabited is well documented. At the time of occupation, forest and woodland fringed the shore. freshwater springs ran nearby and the bay extended further out. The rising sea steadily narrowed the land. In the settlement's last years, the shoreline would have been much closer, and the community may have seen water creeping in behind them. The dig record shows architectural adaptations, houses slightly altered, walls raised, the well deepened, but eventually nature won. The sea level rose by several meters, the coast retreated inland, and Atlit Yam slipped beneath the waves. In the record you find stone-walled houses, a village plan, the well tapping fresh water, fish remains stacked for consumption or trade, human burials beneath floors, all under sediment that marks the shift to marine conditions. The catastrophe lens shows us the forces outside human control. The dig diary reveals what people built, used, believed, and how, slowly or suddenly, their village vanished beneath the sea. Near the seabed today you can trace house walls, hearths still blackened, the well rim, the circle of stones, fish bones scattered among remains of cereals and nuts. While the villagers are gone, the underwater archive remains. When divers swim across the site, they are reading the diary of a community at the edge of land and sea, seeing the ledger of their labour, their power, and ultimately the forces that ended their settlement. Jericho, PPNA, the stone tower, around 8000 BCE. The site rises as a low mound near a great spring, but beneath that gentle rise lies evidence of one of humanity's earliest experiments in permanent settlement. At Jericho, people built homes, walls, towers, and lived in place long enough to leave a trace of planning, craft, and ritual. What follows is the ledger of that work. The core entry in the ledger is the Great Stone Tower. Around 8000 BCE, a circular stone tower was erected against the west side of the settlement mound. It stands about 8.5 metres tall, close to 9 metres in diameter at the base, and its walls are roughly 1.5 metres thick. The interior contains a staircase of 22 steps, carved from flat blocks of limestone, ascending inside the tower. This is one of the earliest known stone-built monumental structures in human history. It suggests not just skill in stonemasonry, but organisation of labour, material procurement, and shared purpose. Linked to the tower is the massive stone wall that once wrapped the settlement. The wall is wide, nearly 1.8 metres at its base, and originally more than 3.6 metres high. It stood beside a ditch cut into bedrock, roughly 8 metres wide and 2.7 metres deep, surrounding the town. The scale of this construction implies that people invested hundreds of working days and cooperated in ways beyond small family groups. The ledger records stonecutters, quarrying, transport, wall raising, stair carving, and urban planning emerging far earlier than had been assumed. Inside the settlement, the remains of houses tell further entries in the ledger. Circular dwellings, roughly 5 metres across, built of sun-dried mud bricks or packed earth, show domestic zones. Floors, hearths and refuse pits lie beneath. Burial of the dead under the floors of dwellings links home and memory. Children, adults laid beneath living rooms. The record speaks of permanence. Spaces were reused, built upon, adapted. The settlement plan lacks rigid street grids, but the density and clustering suggest this was a significant community. Toolkits found at Jericho fill another part of the ledger. Flint blades, chipped cores, side-notched arrowheads, ground stone axes, querns and hammerstones all appear in the domestic deposits. Some blades exhibit gloss from sickle-cutting grasses, pointing to cereal harvesting. Wild emmer wheat and barley grains show up in the botanical remains. Nuts and legumes supplement the diet. The evidence suggests that these people were not only hunting and gathering, but intensifying plant use, perhaps experimenting with cultivation. The ledger thus records economic transition, grain processing, toolware patterns, seed remains. Symbolic and ritual entries appear as well. On the inner walls of the tower and inside houses, archaeologists found carved niches, post holes suggesting roofs, and figures made of stone or plaster. One interpretation suggests the tower may have aligned with the summer solstice sunset over the hills. The record of carved stone, of architectural effort, of communal places signals more than survival. It signals meaning, identity, ritual life. The ledger records that the tower may have served as a meeting place, a marker of community, or an institutional centre of shared activity. Further entries, animal bones from gazelle, deer and wild cattle, fish remains from nearby waters, shells and beads from trade or gathering along coasts, groundstone bowls. All these show a community with access to multiple ecologies and a diversified subsistence economy. The ledger shows not collapse but adaptation. The spring of Ein Ghazal supplied fresh water, the land around offered cereals and pasture. The wall may have protected against flooding as much as enemies. Some scholars argue the wall and ditch served as flood control, not strictly defence. The ledger records both possibilities. Radiocarbon dates anchor the ledger in time. The tower's base is dated to roughly 8,300 BCE, and the settlement phase runs from about 8,500 to 7,500 BCE in its PPNA iteration. The built environment, the households, the toolkits, the plant remains, all fall within this early Neolithic horizon. The ledger of labour, of planning, of architecture, all appears in a society that predates widespread farming and pottery. The scale of labour is telling. Stone specialists quarried limestone, cutters shaped blocks, transporters moved materials, builders raised tall structures, others carved staircases, communal tasks over months or years. One estimate suggests more than 11,000 working days may have been needed for the tower alone. The ledger of time invested gives us insight into social organisation. These were not roving bands, but stable groups investing in their place. Another point in the ledger, the integration of domestic life with communal work. Houses cluster alongside monumental work, toolmaking zones near habitation, storage pits near hearths. The human footprint in the settlement is dense. Burials beneath floors indicate an intimate link between home, ancestry and memory. The ancient residents of Jericho lived, worked, died, and remembered in the same place. The ledger of their lives is embedded in the dirt. Plants too leave their lines in the ledger. Wild cereals show signs of processing. Sickle blades show polish. Grinding stones show use wear. These elements indicate that people were managing plants actively, not simply gathering at random. Nuts, legumes appear in storage contexts. The settlement's location near rich soils and a permanent spring gave a stable base for such experiments. The ledger records the shift from pure foraging toward cultivation, though not yet full farming. In short, the evidence ledger at Jericho holds stone towers and walls, domestic houses and ritual features, toolkits and plant remains, burials and communal labour. It shows a society in transition, from mobile foragers toward settled village builders, from individual households toward broader communal effort. The tower stands tall not simply as masonry, but as notation of ambition, organisation and identity. The settlement deposits inscribe patterns of work, diet, belief and memory. In Jericho's mound, the ledger lies laid bare, waiting to be read. Abu Hureyra, Euphrates, Syria, around 13,000 to 7,000 BCE. The earth here bears the faint whisper of countless footsteps, first of hunters, then of farmers. In a floodplain of the Euphrates, long before the age of cities, the settlement of Abu Hureyra rose and transformed. The tell of Abu Hureyra holds nearly 4,000 years of continuous occupation, during which human life evolved dramatically. What follows is the dig diary, the story of what archaeologists unearthed, layer by layer, trench by trench, tool by tool. In the early seasons of excavation, the team cut trenches into a mound that measured hundreds of meters across. They found the lowest levels filled with microliths, tiny flint blades and points, stone tools of mobile hunter-gatherers. In the deepest horizons, the hearth remains, floors carved into soft bedrock, show occupation by small groups living in pit houses, partially dug into the terrace. At this initial phase, the subsistence economy was dominated by hunting gazelle, fishing along the river, gathering wild plants spread across woodland and steppe. Organic preservation revealed wild cereal grasses, legumes, nuts and leafy plants, all indicating a broad diet of plants collected across multiple environments. As the seasons passed on human timescales, the site changed. The next layer shows architectural shifts. Above the pit huts appear above-ground wooden frames and simple dwellings, more permanent than before. In these buildings, archaeologists found hearths, storage pits, and more diverse toolkits. The plant remains still cluster around wild species, but in this mid-phase we begin to see a rise in grasses like rye, hints of wild wheat, and increased grinding tools, flat stones bearing heavy useware. This signals that the inhabitants were not simply gathering but processing plants intensively. Meanwhile, animal bone studies show selective hunting of younger gazelles, possibly indicating pressure on game populations. The dig diary records this moment as a threshold, people still mobile but rooted long enough to invest in dwellings and storage. Then comes a crucial layer, tied to a climatic reversal known as the Younger Dryas, around 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. The environment grew colder and drier. At Abu Hureyra, the beds reveal shifts in plant pollen, fewer forest species, more steppe grasses, fewer large herds grazing. The human response appears in the tools and deposits. Grinding stones increase, seed stocks of wild cereals rise in quantity, and debris within houses shows stores of plant food. One trench revealed a sudden thick ash layer, suggesting intense burning or event. The dig diary notes that some buildings were abandoned, replaced by new forms. The people confronted change, less wild abundance, more planning for food security. Above that, the upper levels of the tell record the Neolithic village phase. Here, rectangular mud brick houses appear, or at least post-built houses with more permanence. Archaeologists found tens of thousands of charred cereal grains, einkorn, emmer, barley, lentils, all suggestive of cultivated crops rather than purely wild gather. The toolkit changes: polished grinding stones, sickle blades with gloss from cutting grasses, storage pits and bins show organisation of food. Animal bones include domesticated sheep and goats in later levels, though still mixed with wild species. The dig diary shows a settlement size increasing dramatically, from hundreds to possibly thousands of people living year-round, building layered homes, burying their dead in situ. One particular entry, in one of the deepest Neolithic levels, archaeologists found a concentration of cereal chaff impressions in floor plaster. They interpret this as evidence of crop processing built into the house walls. Elsewhere, they found small clay tokens, perhaps counting measures, and craft debris, shell beads, bone tools, fibre work. The story told by the site is one of gradually shifting behaviour, from gathering wild grasses tossed into baskets, to harvesting, processing, storing, perhaps sowing. The dig diary pages register flotated plant remains, seeds carefully collected and analysed, revealing the species' change over time. One study found that in the earlier forager phase over 150 wild plant species were used. Later this dropped to fewer than 10 cultivated types. Emmer wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, soils, tools and diet turned narrower and deeper in planning. Animal bones corroborate the story. Early layers dominated by gazelle and onager. Later phases show more sheep, goats, cattle bones. Younger ages of animals, signs of herd care. Fecal spherulites found in sediment show that dung fuel and possibly penned animals featured in the economy. These entries in the dig diary reveal humans not only living off the land, but managing parts of it. The architecture reflects this. Houses built for long-term use, storage facilities for crops, communal spaces for craft, all of it mapped in the tell's stratigraphy. The dig diary also records large-scale changes in site size and density. In its early forager phase, the population may have been in the low hundreds. By the Neolithic phase, the tell spans many hectares, houses densely packed, hundreds of dwellings. The layering, the debris, the storage pits and hearths stack up. The tools, the bones, the plant remains, each layer builds on the previous. The team found a nearly 5-metre deep sequence of deposits in some trenches, indicating continuous occupation. There are walls plastered with white gypsum, floors painted, houses rebuilt, pits cut, refuse layered. Each entry in the diary adds human back into the site. Another entry, environmental data from cores and pollen show that as climate changed, watercourses shifted, soils eroded, woodland retreated. At Abu Hureyra, the villagers responded by shifting more to crops, more to domesticated animals, more to built form. The dig layers record this adaptation. The plant remains, the tool marks, the architecture, all combine to show that the stepping stone from forager to farmer happened here. Walking across the site in your mind, you can imagine early tents or pit huts beside the river, wild cereals waving in the breeze, hunters returning with gazelle. Then the settlement grows, houses appear, people sit grinding grain, storing seed, perhaps sowing. One generation carries the burden of change. Fewer wild resources, more planting, more storage, more craft. The tell retains their shared marks in stone, seed and bone. The dig diary of Abu Hureyra speaks of ambition, adaptation, permanence, not all at once but step by step. Çayönü Tepesi, SE Turkey, 10th to 8th millennia BCE. In the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, near the upper Tigris tributaries, sits the mound of Çayönü Tepesi. This place holds one of the longest and most detailed records of early village life in Anatolia. The story of Çayönü is written in stone, in toolkits, in architecture and animal bones, all entries in a ledger of change. The first significant line in the ledger is architecture. In the earliest phase of occupation, around the beginning of the 10th millennium BCE, dwellings were round or had rounded corners. These constructions employed wattle and daub on simple foundations. Then a new foundation type appears, the so-called grill plan building. Foundations of parallel stone footings, laid no more than 15 centimetres high, supported elevated plastered floors. These grill plan houses mark a shift, people investing in built environment with dry, insulated floors and elevated platforms. The ledger notes this change in the settlement layout and planning. It indicates not only permanence but concern for comfort, hygiene and durability. Later phases show channeled floors, cobble paving, cell plan houses and large room buildings. The architecture evolves over centuries. Another ledger entry, building tools and measurement. At Çayönü, archaeologists found evidence of architectural planning and measuring. Straight edges, units and orientation appear in the floor plans of public buildings. One study shows the so-called terrazzo building, with plastered floors, carefully levelled, walls set precisely, and measurements consistent across phases. This shows that the people of Çayönü were not only building shelter, but thinking about design, space and the built world. Their craft spans small homes to communal architecture. Turning to subsistence, the ledger records early herd management signals. Faunal remains reveal not just wild species, but early sheep and goat bones, some showing signs of longer life and possible penning. Although full-scale domestication is debated, there's clear movement in this direction. Human-animal relationships deepen. Plant remains also fill the ledger. Wild cereals, legumes, nuts and pulses appear early on, then later phases show signs of intensification. Grinding stones increase, sickle blades appear, wear marks show cutting grasses. Combined with the architectural evidence, it suggests people were settling down, processing plants and managing animals in incremental ways. In the toolkit section of the ledger we see a rich record. Flint blades and cores, scrapers, groundstone axes, pestles and querns. Tools for multiple tasks: woodworking, hunting, plant processing, craft. The density of tool debris is high in certain zones of Çayönü, indicating specific activity zones. One sector for knapping flint, another for woodworking, another for animal processing. This spatial organisation of craft and work reflects a community with labour division, specialisation and planning. The ledger here shows a complex settlement, not a haphazard camp. Burial and social evidence also appear in the ledger. Beneath house floors, human burials, sometimes with goods, sometimes without, skulls plastered or shaped in some phases, a patterned treatment of the dead. The architecture of social memory begins to emerge. Homes hold the dead, floors record layers of occupation, walls record multiple rebuilds. The ledger of social life records that in Çayönü people remained in place long enough to embed relationships, memory and identity in the settlement itself. Environmental data fill further entries. The site lies in a landscape with steppes, hills to high ground, tributary streams, alluvial plain. Wild grasses and woodland fringes gave resources. Over time, the environment changed. Pollen studies indicate shifts in vegetation, soil erosion appears in layers, and the water table may have changed. The ledger notes these changes alongside human response. Architecture adapted, new house types appeared, storage pits appear and expansions occurred. This reflects resilience and adaptation rather than collapse. One striking ledger entry, the grill plan building foundation itself. It consists of a series of narrow, parallel stone footings supporting an above-ground floor. This design insulated the house from damp ground and created a raised living surface. It's an architectural innovation tied to the specific environment of the site: wet ground, flooding risk, hillside conditions. The ledger of innovation thus includes design responding to landscape. Later phases show cobbled paved rooms and large room buildings, signalling social change. Another key entry, craft and ornamentation. Çayönü houses yielded beads, pendants, bone and antler tools, painted plaster floors and wall niches. These indicate that beyond subsistence, people invested in aesthetics, identity and perhaps ritual. One article reports a grid plan building in the site's eastern area dated to the 9th millennium BCE, large communal architecture, plastered floors, organised space. The ledger shows community scale growing, from single-room homes to complex multi-room, multifunction buildings. Yet another ledger line, the deep sequence of deposits. Excavations at Çayönü record many building phases over possibly 2,000 years of occupation. Each rebuild, each house type, each toolkit, each animal bone layer adds a page to the ledger. The stratigraphy reveals continuity and change. Stone walls reused, house plans shifted, practices altered. It becomes clear that Çayönü was a crucible of transformation. In the animal management ledger entry, the site shows early evidence of domesticated caprines, transitional herd types, bones with cut marks and signs of human control. The presence of penned animals is inferred from dung remains and concentrations of animal bones in certain sectors. Although not full pastoralism, the ledger points to the earliest stirrings of animal husbandry. This combines with plant processing evidence to mark Çayönü as one of the first places where the shift from wild to managed resources is clearly visible. Across the ledger, the architecture, toolkits, plant and animal remains, burial practices and environmental data come together to show a settlement living long-term, adapting, innovating and investing in place. The grill plan houses represent a technological shift. The craft debris shows complexity. The animal bones show change in human-animal relationship. Çayönü's evidence ledger is rich. The site stands as a chapter in the story of early village life. Harland Semi, Upper Tigris, around 10,500 to 9,500 BCE. High on the foothills above the Upper Tigris, long before the age of great cities, a small community made its home. The wooded slopes and river terraces around what we now call Harland Semi provided shelter, water, game, nuts and pulses. In a time when most humans still wandered, here people settled, and the landscape shaped their lives just as much as they shaped it. The settlement lies in the Batman province of southeastern Turkey, where weather and terrain created a rich environment. Springs flowed from the limestone, deer and boar moved through oak forest, wild sheep browsed the slopes, and nut trees dropped almonds and pistachios. The community built their huts in shallow depressions, sometimes half-sunken, their walls of stone and wattle, roofs of branches and hide. In these homes, the scents of wood smoke, of roasted nuts, of fresh catch drifted across the day. The settlement was small, maybe a dozen families, but they stayed in place long enough to invest in structure, burial and memory. They were still hunter-gatherers, yet the permanence in the landscape is striking. Remember, the forests were full of nut-bearing trees. The people of Harland Semi gathered wild almonds, even though bitter and less processed. Lentils, vetch, acorns. The plant remains show a reliance on nuts and pulses rather than cereals. At the hearths one could see sacrificial fragments of animals, wild pigs, deer, sheep, goats in transitional states. The hunters tracked game among the hills, the fishermen caught from nearby streams, the gatherers collected from wood and edge. In autumn the pistachio shells cracked beneath their feet and the scent of fresh water drifted across the hillock. Along the earth floors of their dwellings were hearths, stone benches, and a central pit that seems to have served the community rather than just an individual family. In one building phase, two circular structures each 5 to 6 meters in diameter held U-shaped hearths and benches around them, points of gathering, craft, storytelling. In the north of the site, obsidian blades were found, even though the nearest source lay many days' walk away. That means people traded, or travelled, or both. On the landscape, the settlement sat where wood, stone, wild pasture and water converge, a perfect orchestration of resources. In the animal bones recovered, we find wild sheep and goats, but also pigs. Some scholars suggest early pig herd management here, though not full domestication, perhaps controlled hunting plus proximity. The deer remains show selective hunting of smaller or younger animals, possibly indicating pressure on the wild herds or planned exploitation. And so the landscape begins to change. The hills that once held abundant game start to show signs of human impact. Burned patches, cleared glades, disturbed nut trees. people have begun altering the forest edge, making small clearings, harvesting stands of almonds and pistachios with greater intensity. The land is wild but not untouched. It carries the lines of human lives. Back inside the huts, stone vessels carved from limestone appear alongside beads, carved animal figures, pestles and mortars. The presence of decorated artifacts implies that aside from survival, craft, identity and expression mattered. Children may have watched elders shape stone into bowls. Women may have painted or carved. The hearth's glow may have shown the shaping of beads. Outside the houses, the tracks of animal herds or of human paths remained faintly in soil, an indication that this settlement was in regular use, returning season after season, year after year. What stands out at Harland Semi is the blend of rootedness and foraging. Most sites at this time show mobile lifeways, but here the same place is used, built on, repaired, revisited. The architecture changes slowly. In early levels, walls of stone footings surround brush huts. Later levels show more robust stone construction, benches, plastered floors. The settlement not only follows the landscape, it invests in it. The people chose that place for continuity. In winter, the forest would drop its undergrowth. The deer would move downhill, the streams might freeze or slow. Families would huddle in their huts, tending hearths, processing nuts, cleaning hides, carving stone. In spring, the woodlands would fill with birds and game. The pistachio and almond trees would blossom, streams swell. In summer, the edge zones offered grazing for wild sheep and goats. In autumn, the nut harvest came again. Each season was mapped into the landscape and into human activity. They weren't farming fields yet, but they were deeply embedded in the cycles of the land. Over time, small changes appear. Hearths repaired, walls rebuilt, pits reused, benches refaced. These are signs of lasting settlement. To live long enough to rebuild means investment in place. The settlement's orientation toward the slope, the view of water, the access to stone, all suggest the inhabitants understood their environment finely. They weren't simply responding day by day, they were creating a home in the hill. In the global story of human beginnings, Harland Semi matters because it shows that long before large-scale agriculture, there were communities anchored in place, leaning into the landscape rather than only passing through it. They hunted, they gathered, they built, they carved, they cared for their sick and buried their dead under house floors in some levels. The land shaped their lives. Springs determined settlement site. Nut trees determined gathering patterns. Game migration shaped hunting strategy. Stone and obsidian sources shaped craft. Imagine standing near that camp, a low winter morning light filtering through branches, logs crackling in the hearth, the smell of roasting nuts, children running among boulders, hunters returning with deer, women carving stone vessels, the forest whispering in wind. The settlement lies where the tentacles of nature and culture meet. The hills, the springs, the woodlands, all part of the pulse of human living. The landscape and its people looked ahead together, long before fields of grain filled the valley. In that way, Harland Semi invites us not only to see what people lived by, but how they lived with the land, in routine, in hearth smoke, in seasons, in stone and wood. And the hills, water, trees and stones carry their story. Çortik Tepe, Tigris headwaters, early PPNA-PPNB. At the confluence of streams in the upper Tigris Valley, on a gravel terrace near what is now southeastern Turkey, lies the tell of Çortik Tepe. In the early dawn of village life, this site yields deep clues of craft, ritual and everyday labour. What follows is the ledger of evidence, stone by stone, bowl by bowl, grave by grave, of a community in motion. First entry, architecture and settlement scale. Radiocarbon dates indicate occupation began around 10,700 BCE and continued over a millennium. The settlement covers perhaps several hectares. Circular, stone-footed buildings appear early on. Small rooms, low walls, gravel floors, hearths. Over time, the architecture becomes denser. The footprint expands. Foundations hint at shared spaces and repeated rebuilding. The ledger records that humans settled here with intent, not simply passing through. Second entry, burials and ritual. Çortik Tepe contains more than 2,000 burials, many beneath house floors or within settlement trenches. Some graves are richly furnished. Beads, shell ornaments, stone vessels and carved items accompany the dead. One burial, M11, contained 8 decorated chlorite vessels, hundreds of stone beads and shell beads brought from hundreds of kilometers away. Many of the skeletons are painted with red or black pigment. Some show signs of defleshing or post-mortem treatment. These entries point to social differentiation, symbolic expression, and collective memory very early in Neolithic life. Third entry: stone vessels and carved objects. Over 500 stone bowls and vessels carved from limestone or chlorite were found. Many are decorated with incised animal imagery: snakes, goats, humans, and abstract motifs. Some vessels were deliberately broken and placed in burials. The ledger shows that these objects were not purely functional, they carried meaning. The carving, the placement, the ritual breakage all point to a society wrestling with the sacred and the domestic. Fourth entry: toolkits, craft zones and material networks. Dense deposits of flint bladelets, cores, hammerstones indicate local craft production. Obsidian and other exotic raw materials hint at long-distance exchange or mobility. Beads of shell, especially Mediterranean species, stone discs, and carved bone tools appear in large numbers. The quantity and variety of craft objects suggest specialization, sustained labor and social value placed on ornament and symbol. The ledger reads, "This was a settlement of makers as much as gatherers." Fifth entry: subsistence and animal, plant remains. Although Çortik Tepe predates large-scale farming, the faunal record contains wild sheep, goats, deer, onager. Evidence of hunting and animal use is strong. Some bone metrics suggest early management of caprines, but domestication remains debated. Plant remains show wild cereals, legumes and nuts. Storage pits and domestic contexts indicate humans storing and processing plant food. The ledger shows a mixed economy: hunting, gathering, seasonal return, craft, symbol. Sixth entry: stratigraphic sequence and continuity. The tell preserves at least 6 occupational layers, each with architecture, refuse, burials. Instead of seasonal camps, people invested in place. The layering of floors, walls, pits and human remains builds a physical ledger of time and community. Some rooms were rebuilt in the same footprint multiple times. The density of deposits indicates long-term use, not ephemeral occupation. Seventh entry: social complexity and hierarchy. The variation in grave goods, especially the lavish burials with thousands of beads, decorated vessels and pigments, hints at emerging differentiation. Some individuals received richer treatment than others. The placement of communal burials inside houses suggests household groups and perhaps lineage units. The ledger does not yet tell of palaces or kings, but it does record the beginnings of structured society. Eighth entry: ritual architecture and symbolic space. Although no monumental megaliths like later sites appear, the treatment of vessels and burials, the carving of animal symbolism, the presence of abundant beads and ornamental goods indicate symbolic landscapes. Oblique associations between living space, craft, burial and ornament hint at ritual embedded in everyday life. The ledger shows that Çortik Tepe was as much a place of meaning as of meals. Ninth entry: material exchange and mobility. The presence of shell beads from Mediterranean coasts, obsidian from regional sources, and carved items of non-local raw material indicate that Çortik Tepe lay in a network of exchange. The ledger entries show that even early villages were globally connected, not in modern terms, but linked by movement, craft and shared symbol. 10th entry: abandonment and legacy. Around 9250 BCE, the site was abandoned or transformed. While the ledger stops here, the artifacts persist, and their styles resonate in later sites across Upper Mesopotamia. The vessels, beads, carved stone bowls, burials of Çortik Tepe appear as prototypes later echoed in other Neolithic sites. The ledger, then, also functions as start point. Walking amid the trenches of Çortik Tepe, one sees piles of bone, shards of vessel, clusters of beads, charred hearth floors. The ledger writes in myriad signs. Here, a circular house with hearth, there a pit of storage, next to it a child buried beneath the floor with a stone bowl and shell beads. Each entry in the ledger connects architecture, death, craft, and daily life. These entries show us early village dynamics, a community that remained in place, built structures, made objects of beauty and meaning, buried their dead with care, engaged in craft and exchange, processed plant food and hunted wild game. The ledger is rich, layered, visual, embodied. Çortik Tepe stands in the early Neolithic not simply as a settlement, but as a hub of social innovation, craft effort, and ritual expression. Jerel Amar, Syria, around 9,500 to 8,700 BCE. The wind stirs the dust above the Euphrates Valley, and we step into the trench of Jerel Amar, a place where the first pages of village life are visible in the layers of earth. The dig diary opens with the earliest cuttings. Archaeologists uncovered a tell that spans 7 occupation levels on the eastern mound and 6 on the west, showing continuous use from about 9,500 to 8,700 BCE. What they found first was simple round huts, then rectangular houses, then large communal buildings. The diary records the shift. Pit houses give way to stone-footed walls, hearths inside become part of structured rooms, walls are rebuilt again and again. In the earliest phase, the houses cluster, roofed with reeds and wood, near a seasonal stream, with wild cereals growing nearby and game grazing on sloped terraces. Over time, the buildings become more solid. Stone foundations, plastered floors, wall footings become thicker. The settlement shows incremental investment in place. Excavators found in one level a large round structure with a raised bench lining the interior, a central hearth, and a series of storage pits around the sides. In another level, there's a rectangular communal building whose interior benches form an 8-sided polygon and whose walls carry decorative motifs scratched into the plaster. The dig diary notes that some of the earliest rectangles appear while circular huts still stand, a transition in architecture and perhaps in social layout. Storage pits, found beside walls and below floors, contain large quantities of wild cereal chaff, nuts and legumes. Grinding stones show heavy wear. In building WF16, one finds plaster floors with impressions of wild cereal chaff and blades used for harvesting. The diary logs this as evidence of processing plants intensively. The presence of these storage pits and the abundance of plant processing tools suggest more than seasonal gathering, some kind of surplus and planning. But the diary also notes signs of changing environment. Pollen cores show woodland receding, steppe plants increasing. Sediment layers indicate a shift in moisture regimes. The settlement sits near a bend in the Euphrates, and a shallow valley whose course may have shifted over centuries. The inhabitants adapted. New house types appear. Room shapes change, thresholds shift. In one level, a building is burnt and rebuilt with a more regular layout. Beams replaced, walls straightened. The dig diary is full of the grinding stones, the hammered bowls, the chipped flint debris, the storage vessels, the repairs and rebuilds. Each entry tells us the community grew, changed and adapted. Now we move into the debate chamber phase of the structure. What do these finds mean, and what are the points of contention? One debate concerns the communal buildings. Some archaeologists interpret the large bench-lined structure as a meeting hall or ritual space. Others argue it's simply a storage house or workspace for processing and distribution. The building's benches might suggest gatherings, but the storage pits around suggest practical use. We don't yet know whether it was dominantly ritual, communal, or administrative. Another debate turns on agriculture. While the storage of wild cereals and use of sickle blades strongly indicate plant processing, domesticated forms of cereals are not securely present in the earliest levels. Some scholars argue that Jerel Amar shows an in-between economy, neither purely forager nor fully farmer. The presence of storage pits suggests surplus, but the plants remain wild in morphology for much of the occupation. The debate is whether this reflects early cultivation or simply intensive gathering and storage. A further question concerns social differentiation. Some houses near the communal building are of higher quality, with better stone foundations and plaster. Does this suggest emerging hierarchy? Some argue yes. These social signs prefigure later village stratification. Others caution that variability may simply reflect functional differences, storage versus living, rather than status. Another topic under debate, measurement and planning. At Jerel Amar, some building plans show very regular geometry, suggesting use of a module or unit of measure. One study notes that the floor plans of certain buildings may reflect pre-planning in design. Some interpret this as evidence of formalized planning and social control. Others see it as practical architecture evolving locally. The evidence of storage pits is central to another debate. Were people stockpiling food to trade, to redistribute, or simply to buffer seasonal scarcity? The presence of storage implies they were planning ahead, but how far ahead, and for whom? Was the communal building a hub for redistribution, or just for communal processing? These questions remain open. Another contested point, the shift in architecture from round to rectangular houses. At Jerel Amar, the earliest houses are round with low footings. Later ones show rectilinear plans and stronger foundations. Some archaeologists argue that this marks the transition to animal domestication and field agriculture. The rectangle fits a farmhouse. But others caution that architecture shifts may reflect climatic and environmental change, social change, or internal developments rather than direct agricultural shift. Plant remains show intensification, but domestication markers are absent or very early. The debate hinges on whether architecture changed because the economy changed, or economy changed because architecture and society changed. At Jerel Amar, the evidence ledger supports both views, but does not yet close the debate. In the dig layers, the storage pits, communal benches, plastered floors and grinding tools tell the story of a settlement moving toward complex society. But in the debate chamber, scholars wrestle with what moving toward really means. Is it a tipping point village, or simply a long-lived forager community using new tactics? The richness of architecture and planning at Jerel Amar raises the bar. This is not a temporary camp. Yet the absence of fully domesticated cereals in early levels asks caution. The site occupies that grey zone. The dig diary records foundations, tools, pits. The debate chamber interprets them. Walking across the mound of Jerel Amar, you might trace the stone bench inside the communal hall. Imagine the filling of storage pits with wild grains. Hear the carving of reeds for threshing. Smell the hearth in a round hut. See the rebuild of walls after a fire. The dig diary records that sequence, the debate chamber asks why. The building was used by many, the storage pits suggest the many share, yet we do not see feasting halls or palatial layout. The architecture marks a shift, but it also invites questions. In that way, Jerel Amar stands as a key chapter in humanity's move into villages. Ein Ghazal, Jordan, around 7,200 to 5,000 BCE. On the northern edge of modern Amman, a dry wadi cuts through limestone hills. Beneath its surface lies one of the largest and longest-lived Neolithic settlements ever found in the Near East, Ein Ghazal. What was once a thriving village now rests beneath roads and apartment blocks, but its excavated layers reveal an extraordinary ledger of human life, construction, collapse, and renewal across more than 2,000 years. The first entry in the ledger is scale. At its height, around 7,000 BCE, the village covered nearly 15 hectares, a size far beyond most settlements of the time. Excavations show hundreds of closely packed houses built of lime-plastered walls and stone foundations. Streets and courtyards thread between the homes, forming what archaeologists call an early proto-urban layout. Population estimates suggest up to 3,000 people at its peak, perhaps one of the earliest dense communities on Earth. Next entry, architecture. The houses follow a consistent plan. Rectangular rooms with mud brick walls coated in white lime plaster, flat roofs supported by timber beams, and hearths built into the floor. Beneath these floors, archaeologists found repeated rebuilds, evidence that homes were renewed generation after generation. Some rooms served for storage, others for sleeping or cooking. Each dwelling opened onto a courtyard, often shared by several families. The layout shows cooperation but also privacy, a pattern halfway between extended households and neighbourhood clusters. The ledger records a society learning to manage space within permanent walls. Then comes the entry for craft and technology. Across the settlement lie hundreds of plaster fragments, some from house floors, others from figurines and statues. The villagers at Ein Ghazal mastered the production of lime plaster on a massive scale, burning limestone at high temperature in open kilns and mixing it with water to produce a smooth, white surface. Floors were renewed every few years, each layer a pale snapshot of daily life. In these plaster layers, impressions of baskets, reed mats, and footprints survive. They are literal imprints of people who walked this ground 8,000 years ago. The most famous entries in the ledger are the statues. In one sector of the site, archaeologists uncovered caches of life-size human figures sculpted from plaster around a core of bundled reeds. Some stand, others are busts. They have inlaid eyes of bitumen and shells, long necks, stylized faces. More than 30 statues and busts were found buried carefully in pits beneath floors. Each deposit appears deliberate, not discarded but ceremonially interred. The statues were created in groups, then buried together, perhaps after ritual use. Their purpose remains uncertain. Ancestors, spirits, deities, or communal representations of the living. Whatever their meaning, they represent a major artistic and technical achievement, the earliest large human representations known in the ancient world. Another line in the ledger, subsistence. Plant remains show the cultivation of barley, emmer wheat, lentils, peas and chickpeas, fully domesticated crops. Herded goats dominate the faunal record along with sheep and cattle. The villagers relied heavily on animal husbandry. Younger animals were slaughtered for meat, older ones kept for milk and breeding. Hunting of gazelle continued but declined over time. The shift from mixed foraging to managed herds marks a central transformation in daily life. With animals came dung fuel, secondary products, and a rhythm of seasons tied to pasture and harvest. Environmental data form another section of the ledger. Pollen cores and sediment analysis indicate that around 6,500 BCE, the region began to suffer from erosion and deforestation. The villagers had cut trees for fuel and construction, burned lime for plaster, and grazed animals on the hills. Soil fertility fell. Water from the nearby spring became less reliable. Layers of ash and rubble show episodes of abandonment followed by rebuilding. The population may have dropped from thousands to only a few hundred. Some houses were left to decay while others were rebuilt atop old foundations. The ledger records both boom and contraction, the first visible cycles of urban expansion and decline. Burials add another dimension. Beneath floors and courtyards, archaeologists found graves of adults and children. In earlier phases, skulls were removed and plastered with modelled faces, similar to practices known from Jericho and other Levantine sites. Later, this custom vanished, replaced by single inhumations without skull removal. These shifts mark changing ritual life. The plaster statues, created during the mid-occupation, may have replaced earlier ancestor masks. The ledger of belief evolves through these deposits, different generations expressing memory and identity through different forms. Trade and material exchange also appear in the evidence ledger. Obsidian from Anatolia, marine shells from the Red Sea, and greenstone beads from distant sources show long-distance connections. Craft specialists shaped bone tools, polished stone axes, and carved ornaments. The presence of imported goods implies that Ein Ghazal participated in networks that reach far beyond the Jordan Valley, evidence of mobility and shared traditions among early farming societies. The animal bones tell another side of life. Pathologies on goat and sheep skeletons show penning and close confinement, signs of herd management. Cut marks on bones indicate systematic butchery. Burned animal remains appear in communal refuse pits, perhaps after feasting or ritual. In one sector, pits filled with ash, bones and broken tools suggest large gatherings or events. These layers are the archaeological handwriting of collective life, moments when many people cooked, ate, built and discarded together. Later entries in the ledger capture decline. By about 6,200 BCE, climatic cooling and local overuse of resources may have forced migration. The population shrank dramatically. Houses were smaller, more scattered, and the plaster technology simplified. Yet life continued for another millennium. Even as prosperity waned, the people rebuilt, adapted, and left behind floors, walls, hearths, animal dung layers, and fragments of their once grand statues. All these findings form a ledger of human transformation. In the soil of Ein Ghazal lie records of growth, art, ritual, environmental strain, and resilience, written not in words but in plaster, bone, and stone. Every trench, every layer, every buried statue adds another line to the account of how a village on the banks of a small spring became one of the first great experiments in permanent, organised community. Navali Cory, Euphrates, 9th millennium BCE. The waters of the Euphrates are calm now, covering the valley where Navali Cory once stood. Before the Ataturk Dam submerged it in the 1990s, archaeologists opened wide trenches on the slope above the old river channel. Their notebooks, the dig diaries, preserve one of the clearest windows into the world that followed Göbekli Tepe, a settled village of farmers and builders whose stone pillars still spoke the same language of symbols. The first entries in the diary describe the setting. The site lay on a low terrace above the river, surrounded by hills and narrow plains rich in soil and springs. The earliest layers date to the early pre-pottery Neolithic B, around 8,500 to 7,500 BCE. Excavators from the University of Heidelberg found superimposed building levels showing repeated rebuilding over centuries. Each phase recorded a stable community, people who farmed, kept animals, built houses, and carved stone. The diary pages record the discovery of tightly packed rectangular houses, each with stone foundations and mud brick walls. The houses were small, 3 to 5 rooms with plastered floors and benches along the sides. Some had storage bins, others hearths or raised platforms. Many had human burials beneath the floors, a practice common across early Neolithic villages of the region. The entries describe one layer as dense domestic occupation, with parallel rows of houses separated by narrow alleys. The impression is of a permanent, organised village, not a temporary camp. Among the earliest entries, the excavators note a find that changed how they viewed the site. Carved stone pillars, resembling those at Göbekli Tepe, but within domestic and communal buildings. The first T-pillar appeared in a large rectangular hall with polished lime plaster floor, benches along the walls, and a central pair of upright monoliths. More pillars were uncovered as digging continued, some plain, others bearing low-relief carvings of hands, arms, belts, and abstract patterns. The diary calls this space the cult building, an early sanctuary integrated into the heart of a village. It is one of the earliest known instances where monumental art and daily life meet in the same settlement. The diary also lists animal bones and plant remains. The faunal record shows managed herds of goats and sheep, alongside hunted gazelle and wild cattle. Bone measurements and age profiles suggest that by the later occupation phases, herd management, possibly full domestication, was underway. Plant impressions in plaster floors and storage bins include emmer wheat, barley, lentils and peas, domesticated varieties. Grinding stones and sickle blades with silica sheen appear in quantity. The diary notes that Navali Cory represents a mature farming village, its economy no longer dependent on wild harvests. Another entry focuses on art. Beyond the T-pillars, small limestone and clay figurines appear across the site. Stylized human heads, animal forms, seated female figures, and miniature pillars. One famous find, a limestone human head with incised eyes and nose, was discovered near the cult building entrance. Some figurines show traces of red pigment. The diary mentions fragments of decorated plaster, possibly from wall reliefs. Together these finds reveal an aesthetic vocabulary shared with Göbekli Tepe, but adapted to a domestic scale. The people of Navali Cory carved the same symbols yet lived among them daily. The excavation diary for 1986 describes the stratigraphy in careful sequence. Level 1 contained the uppermost village remains, collapsed mud brick, hearth ash, storage pits. Level 2 held the sanctuary with its T-pillars, benches and terrazzo floor made from crushed limestone mixed with burnt lime. Below this, Level 3 yielded earlier rectangular buildings, without pillars but with the same general layout. The stratigraphy indicates that the sanctuary replaced earlier domestic space, a deliberate act of rebuilding for communal purpose. This was not an isolated shrine, but part of a living settlement continually remade. In the field notebooks, one can read about the painstaking process of recording each pillar. The larger examples stood over 2 meters high and weighed several tons. Workers marked each with grid coordinates, drew its outline, and photographed carvings before lifting. Some pillars bore reliefs of human arms wrapping around the sides, a motif known from Göbekli Tepe's Pillar 18. Others were plain but perfectly smoothed. The team concluded that these were the earliest large-scale anthropomorphic sculptures embedded in village architecture. The diary remarks on their alignment, slightly offset from the building's axis, as if framing a focus point, perhaps an altar or hearth. Other entries note domestic activity, chipstone workshops with thousands of flint blades, cores and arrowheads, bone awls and needles, fragments of basketry impressions in plaster. The abundance of craft debris shows full-time artisanship. There are also grinding slabs, mortars and pestles clustered in courtyard zones. In some areas, floors were resurfaced up to 10 times, each new layer sealing earlier refuse, a palimpsest of daily life. The diary records burials beneath house floors, adults placed in flexed position, sometimes accompanied by beads or tools. In one case, a skull was found separately, suggesting removal and reburial, echoing regional ancestor veneration practices. Human and animal symbolism appears throughout the village, but always in context, woven into walls, floors, hearths and graves. It is the everyday infused with meaning. One late entry describes the site's final days before flooding. Archaeologists mapped every feature, dismantled the pillars, and transported several to the Sanliurfa Museum for preservation. Beneath the dust and the rush to record before the waters rose, the diaries capture a vivid picture of life 9,000 years ago, a community of builders, farmers, and carvers living beside a river that would one day drown their home. Navali Cory remains fully documented, plans, photographs, catalogues, each a line in the dig diary of a vanished landscape. The pages show the link between the first temples and the first villages, between art and agriculture, between carved stone and stored grain. The records lie dry in archives now, but the village itself lies beneath still water, sealed under the Euphrates, its terraces, houses and pillars intact below the surface. Leensky V, Iron Gates, Danube, around 9,500 to 6,000 BCE. The river cuts through the cliffs of the Iron Gates, the narrow gorge where the Danube squeezes between Serbia and Romania. At the base of these stone walls, on a low terrace above the waterline, people built homes facing the river. The place we call Leensky V was their world, a landscape of flowing water, fish, rock and ritual. The story begins with the river itself. Here, the Danube is powerful, full of rapids and eddies. It provided fish in abundance: sturgeon, catfish, carp, animals that could feed a community through every season. The riverbanks were fertile, fringed with willow and alder. Behind them rose steep limestone cliffs. Caves and ledges offered shelter. The people who lived here watched the water daily. It dictated food, travel, even the shapes of their houses. Archaeologists uncovered a settlement of more than 130 buildings, laid in terraces that step down toward the river. Each house follows the same geometric plan, a trapezoid with its narrow end facing upstream. Inside, a central stone hearth anchors the floor. The hearths were made with remarkable care, limestone blocks laid in precise arrangements, some carved with spiral or geometric marks. Around them, red ochre was scattered, a mineral pigment linking fire, life and perhaps ceremony. The people renewed their hearths often. Each rebuild marked another cycle of occupation. The houses were semi-subterranean, dug slightly into the ground and roofed with wooden frames and reeds. Their trapezoidal shape is unique in world prehistory. The geometry may have reflected the slope of the terrace or the symbolic order of the community. When viewed from above, the settlement forms a cluster of interlocking shapes, each angled to the flow of the Danube, a human pattern adapted to the current. Between the houses, archaeologists found dozens of stone sculptures, some shaped like stylized fish-human faces with open mouths and almond eyes. They were carved from local sandstone, often placed near hearths or walls. Many appear half human, half fish, perhaps representing spirits of the river. Some are small, portable, others heavy, anchored into the ground. Their surfaces bear lines suggesting gills, scales, or eyes. These carvings are among the earliest known large sculptures in Europe, and they connect directly to the water that sustained the settlement. The lives of Leensky V's people were tied to the rhythms of fishing and foraging. They hunted red deer, wild boar and aurochs, gathered forest fruits and nuts, but the fish dominated their diet. Excavations revealed vast quantities of bones and scales, especially of large catfish, some over 2 meters long. Fishing gear, hooks made from bone, harpoons from antler, litters the site. Season after season, families processed fish on the terraces, smoked or dried it for winter. Yet this was not a transient camp. The occupation lasted millennia, from the late Mesolithic through the early Neolithic. Over those centuries, new ways of living arrived from the south. Farming, herding, pottery. The people of Leensky V encountered these changes gradually. In later layers, archaeologists found fragments of early pottery and bones of domesticated cattle and sheep. But the settlement's character remained rooted in the river and its stones. Human burials weave through the landscape of houses. Some bodies were placed beneath floors, others beside hearths or outside walls. Many were laid in extended position, covered in red ochre. Some graves contain ornaments made from river shells, canine teeth or bone pendants. The relationship between the living and the dead was intimate. Ancestors literally rested under the same floors where fire burned and fish were cooked. The site's stratigraphy reads like a slow dialogue between people and place. Early layers show small hearths and simple shelters. Later ones display elaborated architecture and sculpture. At one point, a large open plaza seems to have served as a communal space, perhaps for gatherings, trade, or ritual. Hearths in this area are oversized, with concentric arrangements of stones, as if meant for ceremonies larger than family life. Around them, the carved sandstone figures stand upright, facing the river. The environment surrounding Leensky V changed over time. As glaciers retreated, forests thickened. The Danube's flow stabilized. Around 6,200 BCE, the climate cooled briefly, and the water levels shifted, forcing rebuilding of terraces. The people adapted again, reconstructing houses higher on the slope. Their architecture shows constant dialogue with the terrain. Houses rebuilt on the same footprints, foundations renewed, hearths replaced. The continuity of place is one of the settlement's defining marks. Artifacts tell more about daily life. Stone tools are fine and standardized. Blades, scrapers and microliths made from high-quality flint brought from kilometers away. Grinding stones appear, used to crush seeds and pigments. Bone tools show wear from hide working. The presence of imported stone hints that people moved along the river, exchanging goods with other groups in the Iron Gate's gorge. In later levels, new elements appear: clay figurines, pottery fragments, traces of domesticated animals. These show contact with early farmers migrating up the Balkans. Yet the local population retained many older customs. Even as agriculture spread, they continued to build trapezoidal houses, use stone hearths, and carve river spirits from sandstone. The landscape itself remained the framework of life. Tstiland, Draga, cliffs for orientation, river for sustenance, terraces for settlement. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1960s, they documented 7 distinct building horizons, each one slightly different, yet all repeating the same pattern of hearth, platform, and geometry. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest structures around 9,500 BCE and the latest around 6,000 BCE, when the first farming villages in the region took hold. This long continuity across major cultural shifts makes Leensky V one of the most remarkable archaeological landscapes in Europe. Today the original site lies partially underwater after the construction of the Iron Gate 1 dam, but the terraces have been reconstructed on higher ground. Visitors can still walk among the trapezoidal floors, see the hearths and sculptures arranged as they once were, and feel the proximity of the river. The air still carries the sound of flowing water, the same sound that shaped the lives of the people who carved their world in stone at the edge of the Danube. Jiahu, Henan, China, around 7,000 to 5,700 BCE. In the central plains of China, where the Huai River cuts through low hills and alluvial soil, lies the ancient site of Jiahu. Long before dynasties or written history, a community here built houses, played music, made pottery, and brewed drinks. What archaeologists found at Jiahu forms one of the earliest and richest ledgers of Neolithic life in East Asia. The first entry in the ledger records the setting, a low rise near the modern village of Jiahu in Henan province. Excavations began in the 1980s, revealing thick layers of Neolithic occupation dating back about 9,000 years. The settlement covered roughly 5 hectares, with more than 40 house foundations, pits, kilns, burials, and trash deposits. The site sat beside a river branch that once flowed into the Huai, providing fish, waterfowl, and fertile silt. The climate was warmer and wetter than today. Bamboo, oak, and wild rice grew in the region. This was a landscape that could feed a growing population. The second entry in the ledger is the architecture. Houses were semi-subterranean, built with wooden posts, wattle and daub, their floors lined with hardened clay. Hearths and storage pits appear inside. Some houses cluster in groups, suggesting extended families. The arrangement shows organisation and permanence. people investing in a place rather than moving seasonally. Around the dwellings, large refuse pits contain ash, pottery sherds, and animal bones. In nearby open areas, archaeologists uncovered kilns for firing pottery, early evidence of specialized craft zones. The third entry concerns subsistence. Charred seeds of millet, rice, and wild soybeans appear in soil samples, showing a mixed economy of gathering and early cultivation. Jiahu is among the earliest sites in China with evidence for rice domestication, though the process was in its infancy. People also fished extensively. Bones of carp, crucian carp, and turtle shells fill the refuse layers. Pig bones are frequent, showing early herd management, while deer, dog, and waterfowl were hunted. Grinding stones and pestles show grain processings. Fishing nets and hooks show control of the river's bounty. The ledger of food reflects diversity and adaptation, an economy both wild and managed. Another striking entry: pottery and craft. The villagers made thick, low-fired vessels with cord-marked or impressed surfaces, bowls, jars, and cooking pots used for storage, boiling, and possibly fermentation. Kiln remains show control of fire temperatures and repeated use. Beside pottery, they made tools from polished stone, adzes, chisels, and grinding slabs. Bone tools include needles, awls, and small ornaments. These objects show a society of artisans working within a stable community. Then comes one of the most famous entries: the bone flutes. In graves and houses, archaeologists uncovered dozens of flutes made from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes. Some are finely tuned, with between 5 and 8 holes carefully drilled along the shaft. Several are playable. When blown, they produce clear pentatonic notes, a musical scale still used in Chinese music today. The oldest examples date to about 6000 BCE, making them among the earliest known playable instruments in the world. The ledger records both craft and art, precision drilling, aesthetic design, and intentional sound. The flutes suggest not just music, but ceremony and identity, so sound woven into social life. The ledger also lists symbols. On turtle shells and bones from the site, archaeologists found incised markings, simple linear signs arranged in patterns. Some resemble later Chinese written characters for eye, sun, or window. They're not writing in the formal sense, but they show symbolic expression used systematically. These signs may have been clan marks, ritual symbols, or proto-script. The presence of such markings centuries before the earliest Chinese writing expands the timeline of symbolic communication. Another ledger entry comes from jars discovered with residues of fermented beverages. Chemical analysis of pottery fragments found traces of rice, honey, and fruit compounds, evidence of an alcoholic drink similar to mead or rice wine. These residues date to around 7000 BCE, the earliest known fermentation evidence in East Asia. The jars were likely used in communal feasts or rituals. Combined with musical instruments and decorated artifacts, the finds portray a culture that celebrated through sound and drink. The burial record forms yet another column in the ledger. Over 400 burials were uncovered, arranged in clusters that seem to represent social groups. Some graves are simple pits, others contain rich offerings: pottery, tools, ornaments, and flutes. A few individuals were buried with tortoiseshells or jade beads, hinting at social distinction. The graves include men, women, and children, showing a settled community with established traditions of care for the dead. The faunal and human bones tell more. Cut marks on animal bones reveal butchery methods. Traces of stress on human skeletons suggest heavy physical activity, especially in grinding and food processing. Dental analysis shows consumption of grains and cooked foods. Stable isotope studies confirm a diet mixing plant and animal sources. The ledger of biology aligns with the material one. People at Jiahu lived from both cultivation and foraging, bridging the Mesolithic and Neolithic worlds. The environment too is written in the evidence. Pollen data from the site show that during occupation the area was wetter, supporting marshes and reeds. As time passed, gradual cooling and human clearance altered the vegetation. The community adapted with irrigation and changing crops. Excavators noted multiple rebuilding phases, implying resilience through environmental fluctuation. Another entry: trade and contact. The jade beads found at Jiahu come from distant sources in eastern China, showing exchange networks already forming across hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian artifacts from faraway volcanic areas reinforce this. The ledger shows movement, ideas, objects, and materials travelling through early Neolithic routes. In later layers, signs of decline appear. Flood deposits suggest rising river levels. Some houses were abandoned and rebuilt on higher ground. Around 5700 BCE, the site was finally deserted, possibly due to flooding or population movement toward emerging farming centres. Yet before it was left behind, the people of Jiahu had built a culture of art, sound, drink, and symbol. Each object recovered, a flute, a jar, a turtle shell with lines, is a line in the ledger of their lives. Together they form a record of one of the earliest complex societies on the Central Plains, where music met ritual, where wild plants turned into crops, and where a new way of life took root beside a quiet branch of the Huai River. Jomon beginnings, Japan, from around 14,500 BCE. When the last ice age loosened its grip on the northern Pacific, the islands of Japan emerged warmer, wetter, and alive with forest and sea. It was here, around 14,500 BCE, that a distinct culture took root, one that would endure for millennia. The people we call Jomon lived among cedar and chestnut trees, gathered shellfish from tidal flats, hunted deer in mountain valleys, and shaped the earliest pottery yet known on Earth. The first traces appear in cave mouths and river terraces from Kyushu to Hokkaido. Layers of dark earth show hearths, post holes, and fragments of reddish pottery decorated with twisted cord impressions. The word Jomon means just that, cord-marked. Radiocarbon dates push these earliest ceramics to nearly 16,000 years old, long before farming societies elsewhere in the world. The vessels are small and thick, likely used for boiling nuts or shellfish. Their creation marks a technological threshold, a foraging people mastering fire, clay, and heat in a permanent way. Archaeologists found that these early Jomon groups settled near coasts, rivers, and lakes. Shell middens, vast mounds of discarded shells and bones, trace their presence along shorelines. Within the heaps lie fish bones, deer antlers, boar tusks, and charred plant seeds. The pattern shows a broad-spectrum diet: seafood, game, nuts, berries, roots. This was a people deeply tied to season and place. In spring they gathered bamboo shoots and river fish. In autumn, acorns and chestnuts. Food was processed and stored in pottery, sometimes buried in pits sealed with leaves or clay. The landscape of early Holocene Japan helped this stability. Rising sea levels turned valleys into bays, isolating the islands and creating rich coastal ecosystems. Forests of oak, beech, and chestnut spread, providing abundant nuts. The Jomon adapted quickly. Rather than roaming widely, they built semi-permanent hamlets near predictable food sources. Excavations at sites like Odai Yamamoto, Fukui Cave, and Kamikuroiwa show repeated use of the same ground over generations. Hearths rebuilt, pits refilled, post holes replaced. These were the beginnings of settled foragers. In one layer from northern Honshu, archaeologists found the remains of round pit dwellings, shallow depressions roofed with poles and thatch. Each held a central hearth and sleeping benches along the edges. Around them, storage pits, work areas, and shell middens formed an organised cluster. The arrangement speaks of community planning, of people staying long enough to rebuild after each winter. The Jomon toolkit is another line in the record. Polished stone axes, adzes, and chisels show woodworking skill. Stone net sinkers and fish hooks indicate river and coastal fishing. Bone and antler were shaped into barbed points and harpoons. Even in the earliest phase, craft specialization is visible. Tool types standardized across regions, implying exchange or shared teaching. The presence of obsidian from distant volcanic sources proves long-distance trade, perhaps by boat along the coast. Fire management appears everywhere. Hearths lined with stones, ash lenses, and layers of charcoal reveal controlled burning, not just for cooking but for clearing forest and encouraging nut trees. The Jomon practiced an early form of landscape engineering. By burning undergrowth and planting favoured trees, they increased yields of chestnut, walnut, and hazelnut. Though not farmers in the formal sense, they reshaped their environment to sustain predictable harvests. In some of the earliest shell mounds, burials appear. Bodies were laid flexed, sprinkled with red pigment, sometimes accompanied by shell bracelets or stone tools. These graves show care and ritual, marking community ties to place. As centuries passed, cemeteries expanded beside villages, and the treatment of the dead became more elaborate. The relationship between the living and the ancestors began early in Jomon life. The pottery evolves through time. Early vessels are plain or cord-marked, but by 10,000 BCE decoration becomes intricate. Combed lines, applied clay ridges and flame-shaped rims. These designs vary by region, reflecting local identities. In the Kanto and Tohoku areas, deep bowls with dramatic flared edges appear, perhaps used for communal cooking or display. Pottery fragments bear soot stains, evidence of cooking over open fire. Their abundance in house floors suggests everyday use, practical yet expressive. The environment around these villages was dynamic. Sea levels continued to rise through the early Holocene, flooding lowlands and pushing settlements uphill. New bays formed, creating estuaries rich in fish and shellfish. The Jomon adjusted again, moving camps seasonally between coast and inland forest. Archaeological layers show this rhythm. Coastal shells alternating with mountain game bones, suggesting yearly cycles. Plant remains show another adaptation. Acorns and horse chestnuts were leached of tannins by soaking in water, then ground into flour. Seeds of perilla, beans and gourds appear in later strata, hinting at early plant management. The Jomon were not yet agriculturalists, but they understood germination and seasonal timing. Music and ritual emerge in the archaeological record as well. Clay figurines known as dogi appear in later Jomon layers, but have roots in these beginnings. Even early deposits contain small pebbles arranged around hearths or miniature vessels placed deliberately in pits. Such acts suggest symbolic behaviour. One flute-like bone fragment from a Kyushu site shows drilled holes, perhaps used to produce sound. The presence of pigment, ornaments and polished stones indicates aesthetic awareness alongside survival. Faunal remains show the breadth of their world. Fish species from both fresh and salt water, bird bones from seasonal migrations, deer and boar from inland forests, and even dolphin and whale bones along coasts. The people at Leensky V carved river spirits in stone. The Jomon, surrounded by sea, may have sung to tides. Everything in the record points to intimacy with water, fishing, trade, travel, and ritual. Toward 8000 BCE, the number of sites multiplies. Regional variations grow, yet all share the same foundation: cord-marked pottery, pit dwellings, seasonal abundance, and the shaping of forest and coast. Archaeologists call this incipient Jomon, the earliest phase of a culture that would last for more than 10,000 years. Standing today in a reconstruction of an early Jomon village, you can imagine the rhythm: smoke curling from low huts, river mist rising at dawn, pots simmering with shellfish, the sound of waves against stone. The people who lived here did not build monuments or empires, but they built continuity, a dialogue between human life, forest, and sea that began as the ice melted and the world grew warm again. Nabta Playa, Western Desert Egypt, around 7000 to 5000 BCE. Far southwest of the Nile, deep in the desert beyond where the dunes turn to rock, lies a dry basin called Nabta Playa. Today it looks empty, a flat, cracked floor surrounded by sand and low hills, but in the early Holocene, when summer monsoons reached farther north, this place was alive with water, grass and people. During those centuries, the desert turned green, dotted with seasonal lakes. It was here that small pastoral groups built stone circles, tumuli and alignments that still raise questions no one has fully answered. The debates begin with the stones themselves. In the centre of the playa stand megaliths arranged in a small circle roughly 4 meters across. Several upright slabs form pairs. One stands higher than the rest, casting a long shadow at dawn and dusk. Around them lie larger monoliths in straight lines radiating outward. Some archaeologists interpret these as a primitive calendar, a marker for the summer solstice, when rains arrived and water returned to the basin. Others caution that the alignments could be coincidental, the product of erosion and chance placement. The calendar circle, as it's often called, remains the heart of the debate, whether it represents deliberate astronomical observation or symbolic geometry unrelated to the sky. Another point of discussion concerns the builders. The earliest occupation layers at Nabta Playa date to around 9,000 years ago. Charcoal, hearths and pottery fragments show that people camped here during the wet months when shallow lakes filled the basin. They herded cattle, gathered wild grains and hunted gazelle. Radiocarbon dates cluster around 7000–5000 BCE, a time when the Sahara supported widespread seasonal settlements. Scholars disagree whether the pastoralists of Nabta were early Nubians connected to the Nile Valley or independent desert groups who later influenced the Nile cultures. The evidence cuts both ways. Pottery styles share traits with Upper Egypt, but the way of life and cattle herding around Playa Lakes is uniquely Saharan. There's also debate about the stone's purpose. Some researchers, like Fred Wendorf and his team, who excavated the site in the 1970s and 1990s, proposed that the alignments marked solar positions tied to the monsoon cycle. The largest megalith rows point toward where the sun rose at the summer solstice around 4,800 BCE. The timing would have signalled the coming of rains, vital for herders depending on fresh pasture. Critics note that without detailed astronomical measurement tools, maintaining precise orientation across centuries would have been difficult. Yet supporters argue that simple observation of sunrise points on the horizon, repeated year after year, could establish these lines. Another line of discussion centres on ritual. Nearby tumuli, stone-covered mounds, contain cattle burials. In one, the skeleton of an entire cow lies carefully placed in a clay-lined pit covered with sandstone blocks. Such treatment suggests symbolic or sacred value. Later tumuli include smaller animal bones and occasional human remains. The repetition of this practice implies continuity of belief, possibly linked to cattle as a symbol of fertility and survival. Some researchers see in these burials the earliest evidence of ritual animal sacrifice in Africa. Others warn that the interpretation is speculative. The pits might mark feasting sites or food storage rather than shrines. As the debate quiets, the evidence ledger begins. Excavations document successive cultural layers separated by desert sands. In the oldest levels, hearths, grinding stones and pottery show short seasonal visits by foragers. The pottery is distinctive, impressed with dotted and wavy lines similar to early Saharan styles. By about 7000 BCE, artifacts shift. More grinding tools, larger hearths, and traces of corrals appear, indicating herding. Animal bones, mostly cattle with some goat and gazelle, dominate the assemblage. The ledger shows the gradual transition from hunting to managed pastoralism. Later layers record the construction of megalithic structures. The stones used for the circle and alignments were quarried locally from sandstone outcrops, some weighing over a ton. Excavators found sockets cut into bedrock to hold them upright, proof of deliberate placement. The circle's design is not monumental in size, but in precision, a planned arrangement, unlike random scatter. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal beneath nearby stones confirm use around 4,500 BCE, just before the Sahara began to dry again. Another entry concerns settlement features: hut foundations, hearth clusters, and storage pits. The pattern suggests a small community returning seasonally. Grinding stones and mortars show intensive processing of wild millet and tubers. Animal dung layers point to penned livestock. The presence of decorated pottery in domestic areas alongside ritual structures supports the idea of a mixed economic and ceremonial site. In the ledger's section on environment, sediment analysis shows alternating wet and dry phases. Pollen grains from lake beds indicate grasses, sedges, and acacia, a savanna landscape. Faunal remains of fish, crocodile, and turtle confirm standing water nearby. As the monsoon belt retreated southward after 5000 BCE, the lake shrank and occupation ceased. The stones remained, slowly surrounded by sand. The ledger of art and symbol includes carved and arranged stones beyond the calendar circle. Some monoliths bear cup marks, others are shaped roughly like human torsos. A group of tall-standing stones once formed an avenue leading toward the central ring, perhaps marking processional movement. No inscriptions or carvings tie them to known Egyptian motifs. This was a distinct earlier tradition. The excavation notebooks also record radiocarbon samples from hearths, residues from pottery, and isotopic analysis of cattle bones. The results confirm reliance on livestock milk and meat, and seasonal presence from late spring through summer. The data align with the solstitial hypothesis. People returned when the rains began. In museum storerooms today, the artifacts of Nabta Playa fill boxes. Fragments of wavy-line pottery, grinding stones smoothed by years of use, flakes of chert from tool-making. Each is a line in the ledger of life in a green Sahara. The site's stones, standing silent under the desert sun, remain open to interpretation: observatory, shrine, or calendar of rains. What the debates and the evidence agree on is that thousands of years before the pyramids, pastoralists of the Western Desert were already watching the horizon, aligning stone with sky and living in rhythm with the returning monsoon. Çatalhöyük, Central Anatolia, around 7,400 to 6,200 BCE. In the flat expanse of the Konya Plain, among dry grassland and distant volcanoes, a mound rises silently above the horizon. On this low hill stood a settlement where for more than 1,000 years people lived densely side by side, building, painting, burying their dead, all without streets or obvious public squares. This mound is Çatalhöyük. Life at Çatalhöyük was woven with the landscape around it. The river valleys, the fields of wild cereals, the hills where game grazed. Houses were built of mud brick and laid out in tight rows, sharing walls, forming a continuous cluster of roofs. To enter their homes, people climbed ladders through rooftop openings. The roof terraces became paths. The architecture responded to the plain. They soared little but spread wide, adapting to terrain, climate, and the need for shelter from wind, sun, and cold. Inside, the smells of hearth smoke, plaster dust, animal hide, and grain mingled. The seasons were marked by tasks: harvesting grain from the fields, herding goats and sheep across the plain, slaughtering in autumn, and grinding stored grain in winter. The environment shaped their schedule, the settlement embraced it, but the mound itself grew because of that continuity. As houses aged, floors cracked, walls collapsed, the people repaired, rebuilt, and raised terraces. Over time, 18 or more building layers stacked up, each a generation's house atop another. The landscape of home became an archive of time. Beneath floors lay burials, beneath benches lay ox horns, on walls hung paintings of animals and scenes of life. The living landscape and the built landscape merged. Children were born in one house, buried under its floor, and their descendants climbed from the new floor above. The plain outside remained constant, yet inside the settlement time layered deeply. Now, moving to the evidence ledger, first entry, scale and continuity. The eastern mound of Çatalhöyük shows occupation from around 7,400 BCE to about 6,200 BCE. Archaeologists uncovered many successive building levels, at least 18 stacked over centuries. The size of the settlement at its peak is estimated to cover around 14 hectares, with perhaps a few thousand people living there in dense clustering. This much continuous occupation in one place is rare in early agricultural societies. Second entry, architecture and layout. The houses share walls back to back, no external streets, and roof access via ladders. Interiors were plastered, raised platforms lined one side, hearths sat in the centre or southwest corner, and access holes lay in the roofs. Storage pits and bins appeared near walls. The rooftop-connected homes created a communal surface above. This layout speaks of neighbour-rich lives, of walking across roofs, of children playing and adults working above ground level. The form of the settlement itself records how people lived. Third entry, art and ritual. Murals and reliefs adorn many walls. Wild cattle, stags, vultures, headless figures, geometric patterns. Inside some homes, archaeologists found plastered bull horns mounted on walls, benches smoothed and painted, and pits filled with ritual deposit items. Burials beneath floors often include ochre-painted skulls, personal ornaments, and other symbolic objects. The evidence shows that ritual was embedded in daily life. Houses served both living and ancestors. Walls spoke of myth and story. Platforms held food and ceremony. Fourth entry, economy and craft. Plant remains show domesticated emmer and einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. Animal bones are dominated by sheep and goats, later by cattle. Evidence of wild hunting persists: aurochs, red deer, boar. The settlement lay in a productive zone: fields, pasture, and trade. Obsidian from 150 to 200 kilometers away appears in tool assemblages. Beads of marble, shell, and turquoise suggest long-distance exchange. Grinding stones, stone axes and adzes, bone needles and spindle whorls record craft specializations. The ledger shows that food production, craft and trade were all part of daily life. Fifth entry, death and memory. Over 400 burials are documented in the eastern mound alone. Bodies were often placed in flex position beneath house floors or benches. Some skulls were removed later and plastered to resemble faces. Others received no special treatment. The variation suggests both communal norms and individual difference. In some houses, dozens of individuals were buried across generations, showing ancestry and continued presence. The evidence records that home was also cemetery and family was anchored in place. Sixth entry, material and environmental change. Sediment, pollen and botanical data indicate the climate of the Konya Plain shifted during Çatalhöyük's occupation, from wetter, more favourable conditions toward drier in the later Neolithic. Soil erosion increased, lake levels fell, and the fields required more human input. Floors show repair, walls show rebuilding, storage bins reflect caution. Material artefacts adjust. In later layers, fewer wild animal remains, more managed stock. The ledger writes of people adapting their world. Seventh entry, social organisation and equality. Unlike later urban centres, houses at Çatalhöyük show little variation in size and so far no evidence of palaces or elite towers. Many researchers interpret the settlement as relatively egalitarian. Craft items, food remains and architectural quality vary but not dramatically. Adult male and female skeletons show similar diets and workload indicators. In the evidence ledger of social life, Çatalhöyük shows a community where neighbourhoods, kin groups and craft seem to coexist without strong, visible hierarchy. Eighth entry, abandonment and legacy. Around 6200 BCE, the eastern mound was largely abandoned. The reasons remain uncertain: climate change, resource pressure, social shift. Yet the mound remained as raised terrain. The town's memory persisted. In the stratigraphy and in the artifacts, the evidence shows continuity becoming cessation. The settlement's final years record fewer rebuilds, less investment, and gradually less activity. The ledger notes the ending, though not the cause. Walking through the rooms of Çatalhöyük in our mind, you might step from one rooftop to another, feel the clay floor underfoot, see a bullhorn mounted on a wall, touch a plaster duck figure, and crouch beside a storage bin filled with grain. The plain outside stretches wide, the volcano looms distant, and you see a village alive with craft, art and habitation. The walls, floors, hearths and burials remain as entries in the evidence ledger, each a testament to how people lived, laboured, believed and endured here, thousands of years before history was written. Mehrgarh, Balochistan, Pakistan, sit as 7th millennium BCE. It began in the foothills of a long, dry plain, where the Bolan River cuts through the rugged mountains of Balochistan. Here, at the edge of South Asia's Great Indus Valley, lies the ancient settlement of Mehrgarh, a place that bridges the world of foragers and the first farmers of the Indian subcontinent. Archaeologists arrived here in the 1970s, walking through wind-carved ridges dotted with potsherds. The site stretched across several mounds, each representing layers of habitation. The lowest, known as Period 1, dated to around 7000 BCE. When the first trench was opened, fragments of mud brick walls appeared, followed by hearths, storage pits, and beneath them, the bones of cattle and goats. It was one of the earliest farming villages in all of South Asia. The diary of the excavation notes how the first season's work revealed something unexpected. Beneath the dust lay well-built rectangular houses made of mud brick, the same kind of construction seen later in the Indus Valley cities thousands of years afterward. The walls enclosed rooms that served distinct functions: living spaces, work areas, and storage bins for grain. The pottery from the lowest levels was crude, handmade, and unpainted. But in upper layers, painted motifs began to appear, geometric patterns in red and black. These small changes mark the evolution of one of the world's first craft traditions. The daily notes describe the stratigraphy, occupation layers about 1 metre thick, each representing generations of rebuilding. In the earliest phase, people still hunted wild animals, deer, gazelle and onager. But evidence of domestication was clear. The bones of cattle, sheep and goats showed penning marks, and seeds of barley and wheat were found carbonized in hearth ash. Plant impressions in clay confirmed that they were cultivating cereals brought from Western Asia, adapting them to local soil and climate. This was an economy of transition. Still partly mobile, but already settled enough to invest in permanent dwellings and storage. During the second season, the team uncovered burial areas on the periphery of the settlement. Each grave contained a single body, placed in a flexed position, often accompanied by beads of lapis lazuli, shells and turquoise. These materials came from far away, the coast of Makran, the hills of Afghanistan, proving that early Mehrgarh was connected to long-distance trade networks even in the 7th millennium BCE. The diary entries note that some burials included finely worked bone tools or decorated pottery, hinting at status differences already emerging in the community. In one trench, a layer of ash and charred grain revealed a sudden event, perhaps a fire that swept through a cluster of houses, but rebuilding followed almost immediately. New walls rose over the old foundations, and fresh plaster sealed the damage. The persistence of construction showed how deeply rooted the settlement had become. By around 6000 BCE, Mehrgarh covered more than a dozen hectares, a small but thriving village of farmers, herders and artisans living at the crossroads between the Iranian plateau and the Indian plains. As work continued, the excavation notebooks filled with sketches of small objects. There were beads of carnelian and shell, pendants carved from bone, and fragments of fired clay figurines, mostly female, with exaggerated hips and breasts. The archaeologists debated their meaning, fertility symbols, protective charms, or mere toys. Whatever their purpose, they reveal the early presence of symbolic art in South Asia. The craftsmanship improved over time, showing experimentation with kilns and pigments. Later levels produced polished stone tools, early copper artifacts, and traces of cotton fibre. Among the oldest evidence of cotton use in the world, each layer told a different phase of adaptation. In the lower levels, mud brick houses stood in small clusters separated by open areas. In later ones, the layout grew more organised, suggesting family compounds and perhaps shared courtyards. The tools changed too, sickle blades with sheen from harvesting, grinding stones worn by daily use, and perforated discs that may have served as weights or spindles. Every artefact pointed to an increasingly settled rhythm of life. The dig diary also records environmental clues. Charcoal analysis showed tamarisk and acacia, trees typical of river margins, confirming that the Bolan River flowed nearby year-round. Pollen and seed samples revealed cultivated barley and wheat alongside wild plants like jujube and dates. The mix suggested a diversified subsistence system, farming near watercourses, herding on the plains, and gathering wild fruits and fuelwood. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from the graves of Period 3, dating to around 5000 BCE. Among the burials were skulls showing signs of dental drilling, small, precise holes made with a stone-tipped tool. Microscopic analysis confirmed that these holes were made while the individuals were alive, marking one of the earliest known examples of dental treatment in human history. This finding offered a glimpse into the medical knowledge of the early farmers of Mehrgarh, a skill that predates writing by millennia. In the middle layers, clay storage bins grew larger and pottery became more refined. Painted bowls featured complex designs, zigzags, crosshatches, and lines forming animal shapes. The pigments used came from local minerals, hematite and manganese. Some vessels bore impressions of woven mats, suggesting that baskets were used as moulds before firing. Others had spouts or handles, showing experimentation with form and function. As centuries passed, the settlement expanded across multiple mounds. Period 6, around 4000 BCE, introduced copper beads and tools, indicating the first steps toward metallurgy in the region. Trade routes likely connected Mehrgarh with communities to the west in Iran and Mesopotamia, and to the east toward the Indus floodplains. The techniques and traditions seen here, the mud brick architecture, the craft specialization, the painted ceramics, would later evolve into the cultural foundation of the Indus Valley civilization. By the final entries of the diary, the site begins to change. The climate grew drier, the Bolan River less reliable. Some houses were abandoned, and the population moved eastward toward more stable water sources. But in the soil layers they left behind, the story remains written in bone and clay, the first farmers of South Asia, shaping a new way of life at the edge of the desert. La Draga, Banyoles, Spain, around 5300 to 5000 BCE. On the northern edge of Lake Banyoles in Catalonia, the water laps quietly against reeds and willow roots. Beneath this peaceful surface lies the outline of one of Europe's oldest lakeshore villages, La Draga. Discovered in the 1990s, it has given archaeologists something rare: wood preserved for more than 7,000 years, frozen in mud and water. The settlement reveals how early farmers of the Western Mediterranean lived at the edge of land and lake between forest, field and reflection. Excavation notebooks begin with the soil itself, dark, saturated layers where oxygen never reached. The absence of air preserved organic materials that usually disappear. Wooden beams, woven mats, basketry, ropes, even seeds and leaves. When the first test trenches were opened, the team expected little more than stone tools and pottery. Instead, they uncovered the remains of wooden platforms and upright posts still standing in their original positions. The site had survived because it sank into the waterlogged sediments of the lake as the shoreline shifted. The first entry in the evidence ledger, architecture. More than 100 post holes and preserved timbers define rectangular houses built on the lakeshore. The posts were of oak, ash and hazel, split with polished stone axes. Some still showed bark and tool marks. Floors were made of planks laid side by side. Between them, bundles of reeds and straw acted as insulation. Archaeologists reconstructed how these houses rose on slightly elevated platforms, dry but close to water, connected by narrow walkways. The wood was dated to around 5,300 BCE, Neolithic farmers living at the dawn of Europe's agricultural spread. Next entry, tools and craftsmanship. From the mud came dozens of wooden implements, adzes, sickles, handles, digging sticks, and bows. The adzes were hafted with polished stone blades secured by plant fibre cords. Sickles bore traces of silica gloss from harvesting cereal stalks. Several bows shaped from yew, measured over a metre long, some broken, others complete, their surfaces smoothed with sandstone. The preservation allowed researchers to see not just shape but technique, how early carpenters selected, split and bent wood for strength. Bone and antler tools appeared alongside them. Needles, awls and spatulas, many still sharp. The third line of the ledger lists domestic artefacts. Pottery fragments with round bases and impressed decoration filled hearth areas. Most vessels were coarse but sturdy, used for cooking and storage. Inside them, residue analysis found cereal starch and animal fat. Grinding stones and pestles surrounded the hearths, stained with traces of emmer and barley. Loom weights and spindle whorls indicate weaving, and bundles of preserved plant fibres suggest linen or nettle thread. Nothing at La Draga was monumental, yet everything carried detail, each piece a record of routine, of small decisions repeated over seasons. Further in the ledger, under subsistence, the inventory expands. Carbonized seeds from wheat, barley and peas show that agriculture had already taken firm root. The villagers cultivated cereals in nearby clearings and kept domestic animals. Bones of sheep, goats, cattle and pigs make up most of the faunal remains. Hunting still played a role. Deer, wild boar and aurochs are present, but farming dominated. Fish bones and freshwater shells confirm use of the lake, and some houses contain net sinkers and hooks carved from bone. The shoreline supplied reeds, water plants and birds, rounding out a diet that joined field and water. One of the most striking sections of the evidence ledger concerns preserved organic objects, items almost never found at Neolithic sites. Basket fragments woven from willow and grass retain their shape. Cords twisted from flax and lime bark show early rope making. Wooden containers carved from single trunks appear alongside paddles that may have belonged to dugout canoes. A few preserved handles still hold stone blades in place, the binding intact after millennia. These artifacts make La Draga one of the best documented wooden assemblages of the early Neolithic anywhere in Europe. The next entry describes environmental reconstruction. Core samples from the lakebed show layers of pollen, oak, hazel, pine, and grasses, painting a picture of a mild, humid climate. The people of La Draga lived in a mixed landscape: forested slopes, open meadows, and freshwater edge. Traces of charred wood reveal controlled burning, likely for clearing fields or regenerating pastures. The sediment around the post contains seeds of cultivated crops mixed with wild plants such as water lily and bulrush, showing that daily life stretched between farming and foraging. The animal evidence adds texture to the story. Cut marks on bones demonstrate butchery with polished stone blades. Horncores of cattle appear near hearths, sometimes arranged deliberately, perhaps with symbolic meaning. Dog bones, including one complete skeleton buried near the house corner, hint at companionship or ritual association. The animals speak of herding, hunting, and shared habitation, a community where livestock, pets, and people shaped one another's space. In another section of the ledger appear ornaments and personal objects. Beads of stone, bone, and shell were found in clusters, likely from necklaces. One small pendant made of greenish serpentine was drilled carefully through the centre. Another bead of Mediterranean shell suggests trade or travel along the coast. Such items link La Draga to a wider network of Neolithic communities spreading across Iberia and southern France, connected not by cities or states but by exchange of goods and ideas. The final pages of the ledger deal with fire and rebuilding. Burned layers cut through several house floors, showing that parts of the settlement were destroyed and rebuilt at least twice. Charcoal analysis identifies oak and beech timbers, species chosen for strength and resistance. After each fire, the villagers rebuilt on the same footprint, placing new posts in old sockets. This cycle of construction over half a millennium created overlapping structures now preserved in the lake mud, each phase recording resilience and continuity. Throughout the site, the pattern of daily life is clear. Small households organised around hearths, sharing work, food, and maintenance of wooden architecture. The shoreline itself was alive with sound. The clatter of grain grinding, the crack of wood splitting, the calls of birds over the water. Every post and plank preserved beneath the lake today carries microscopic traces of those gestures. The evidence ledger of La Draga ends not with disappearance, but with water. Around 5000 BCE, the shoreline shifted, flooding the settlement. The inhabitants moved inland, leaving their tools, floors, and hearths to sink beneath sediment. For archaeologists, that flood became a gift, sealing the world of early farmers in oxygen-free mud, preserving the only complete Neolithic wooden village known in the Western Mediterranean. Beneath the waters of Lake Banyoles, the posts of La Draga still stand, quiet witnesses to a lakeshore life lived 7,000 years ago. Marawah Island, UAE, around 7,500 years ago. Off the western coast of Abu Dhabi, where the Persian Gulf meets the desert, a cluster of low islands rises from turquoise shallows. At first glance, Marawah looks timeless. Dunes, salt flats, limestone ridges, and coral reefs stretching into clear water. Yet beneath this calm surface lies the story of one of Arabia's earliest known villages, built more than 7,500 years ago. Here, long before cities like Ur or Babylon, people shaped stone houses beside the sea and lived from the rhythm of tides and wind. When archaeologists mapped the island from the air, they saw its strange geometry, a maze of channels, lagoons, and sandbars linking it to the mainland. Thousands of years ago, when the climate was wetter and the sea lower, this was not an island but part of a broad coastal plain. Freshwater springs, mangroves, and grassy flats covered the land. In this landscape, families built small clusters of houses on higher ground, overlooking the sea, close to where fish and shellfish were abundant. The first excavation season began with survey grids drawn over an area known as MR11 on the island's northwestern edge. Stone foundations emerged from the sand, circular and rectangular rooms with low walls built of coral and beach rock, mortared with gypsum. Unlike temporary camps found elsewhere along the Gulf, these structures were permanent, designed to last. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from hearths placed them around 5,800 BCE, making Marawah one of the oldest known coastal settlements in the Arabian Peninsula. The map of the site shows a tight cluster of rooms around open courtyards. Some walls were thick enough to support roofs of branches and palm fronds. Floors of hard-packed plaster bear traces of fire pits, grinding stones and storage jars. The arrangement suggests family units sharing work and food, living close to one another in a compact hamlet. In one building, archaeologists found a stone platform with a row of small holes cut into it, perhaps a stand for wooden posts or a rack for drying fish. The setting makes sense. The sea lies just meters away, and the entire site looks toward the horizon where the sun sets over the Gulf. Artifacts begin to populate the map. Hundreds of fish bones, shell beads, stone tools, and pieces of painted plaster. The majority of animal remains belong to fish such as grouper, sea bream, and tuna, alongside dugong and turtle. Shell middens around the houses show that shellfish were harvested on a large scale, and net sinkers made from limestone suggest organised fishing. The diet was marine, yet other finds prove contact with inland resources. Flint blades and arrowheads made from high-quality stone that does not occur naturally on the island, and pottery fragments of a style linked to Mesopotamia and Iran. These clues mark Marawah as a hub, part of an early trade network along the Gulf's shallow coast. As the map broadens to include the wider island, it reveals other traces of life. Burial sites appear near the settlement, small mounds of stone covering individual graves. One skeleton discovered during the excavation lay extended face upward, with a shell-bead necklace still around the neck, the oldest known human burial in the UAE. Nearby, small hearths, tools, and food remains show that life and death shared the same landscape. The bones were analysed and found to belong to a young adult, robust and healthy, living on a diet rich in seafood and plants from nearby oases. The map transitions into the living world of the past, the lives and landscapes of Marawah's people. At dawn, the air would have smelled of salt and wood smoke. Women ground cereal grains on flat stones, while men repaired nets or carved fishhooks from bone. Children collected shells and watched for dolphins offshore. The settlement's rhythm followed the tides, fishing at dawn, drying catches through the afternoon heat, and cooking in open courtyards at dusk. The sea was both larder and highway, connecting the island to other communities along the Gulf. Evidence from the tools and pottery speaks to these connections. Some vessels are made from clay, typical of Mesopotamian sites, perhaps imported through exchange for pearls, fish, or bitumen. Obsidian blades, volcanic glass from Anatolia, or Iran, appear among the local stone tools, proof that goods travelled hundreds of kilometres even in this early period. Other finds, like small stone weights and pierced shells, may have served as trade tokens or ornaments marking social ties. In one area, archaeologists uncovered a concentration of animal bones belonging to sheep and goat, the earliest evidence of herding in eastern Arabia. These animals were not native to the islands. They were brought by boat from inland regions, showing that seafaring had already become a way of life. The combination of fishing, herding, and trade made Marawah's people adaptable, balancing the unpredictability of sea harvests with controlled food sources on land. Inside the houses, the layout tells more of their story. Each room had a hearth built in the corner, sometimes ringed with stones blackened by heat. Grinding stones lay nearby, and fragments of plastered jars suggest food storage. One house preserved the floor print of a large pot embedded in clay, perhaps for holding dried fish or grain. Another contained a small cache of shell beads and a single pierced pearl, an early glimpse of the Gulf's long relationship with pearling. Environmental evidence adds another layer. Around 7,500 years ago, the climate of Arabia was wetter than today. Monsoon rains reached farther north, feeding shallow lakes and freshwater springs. Mangroves bordered the shore, and the Gulf was narrower. Over the following millennia, as sea levels rose, the lowlands flooded, cutting Marawah off from the mainland. The people adapted for a time, fishing from boats and moving seasonally between islands, until eventually the rising sea and shifting sands forced abandonment. In the archaeological record, the story ends gently. The last hearths were covered by drifting sand, the roofs collapsed, and wind buried the walls. For thousands of years, the site lay hidden until the modern excavations exposed it again. Walls still upright, fish bones still packed in midden heaps, and beads still glimmering in the dust. Submerged Australian shelf sites. Murujuga, Cape Bruguières, 8,500 to 7,000 BP. Far north along the coast of Western Australia, the sea sparkles against red rock and mangrove flats. The place is called Murujuga, a landscape of ancient carvings, islands, and tidal inlets. Today it looks like shoreline, but for tens of thousands of years it was dry land. Families once camped here, hunted wallabies, and walked across a broad coastal plain that stretched far beyond the horizon. Then, as the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose, the plain disappeared beneath the waves. What remains of that world now lies underwater on the drowned continental shelf. For generations, this story lived in Aboriginal oral tradition. Coastal groups spoke of rising seas, of the land being swallowed, of ancestors moving inland as the shoreline changed. Archaeologists long suspected these memories were more than myth, that somewhere beneath the modern seabed were traces of camps and tools from before the flood. It took thousands of years, but science finally caught up with the story. The catastrophe began about 14,000 years ago, when global glaciers melted and sea levels started climbing. Across northern Australia, the ocean advanced nearly 100 metres vertically, pushing the coastline inland by more than 100 kilometres. The once broad Sahul Shelf, a land bridge connecting Australia to New Guinea and Indonesia, vanished. Rivers that had once meandered through savanna turned into drowned valleys. What had been open country became archipelago. Through this lens, the story of Marawah and Cape Bruguière unfolds. The underwater archaeology project, launched in 2017, set out to test whether evidence of ancient human life could survive below the sea. Divers and remote-operated vehicles mapped an area along the Dampier archipelago, focusing on channels that were dry between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. In 2019, they found what no one had before: stone artifacts still lying on the seabed where people had once dropped them. At Cape Bruguière, divers documented more than 260 stone tools scattered across a stretch of submerged shoreline. Many were flakes, cores, and hammerstones, the byproducts of tool making. Others showed retouched edges for cutting or scraping. The artifacts rested among fossilized mangrove roots and river pebbles, evidence that the area had once been a tidal estuary, not open sea. Radiocarbon dating of marine sediments around them placed the submergence between 8,500 and 7,000 years ago. This meant the site must predate that flooding, proof that humans had lived and worked there before the ocean arrived. Nearby, at the now underwater Cape Bruguière channel, sonar scans revealed terraces and rock formations consistent with ancient creek banks. Divers retrieved additional artifacts from depths of 2 to 3 metres. The preservation was extraordinary. Despite millennia underwater, the stones remained sharp, protected by silt and coral. The discovery marked the first verified submerged Aboriginal site on the continental shelf of Australia. The catastrophe lens widens beyond this single find. Around Marawah, the seabed once hosted rivers, dunes and lakes that supported people for at least 50,000 years. As sea levels rose, groups moved gradually uphill, leaving successive camps behind. On nearby islands, which were once inland hills, rock art panels now stand at the edge of the tide, carved before those slopes became coastal cliffs. The engravings depict animals that no longer live in the region: giant kangaroos, emus, and reptiles from the Ice Age savanna. Each carving is a witness to the changing world that surrounded its makers. The catastrophe was not sudden like a single flood, but relentless. Year after year, the shoreline crept inland by meters. In a human lifetime, the sea might advance the length of a valley or a bay. Families would pack their tools, abandon fishing spots, and resettle further inland, watching the familiar plains drown. This slow disaster shaped migration, story, and memory. Aboriginal songlines, oral maps connecting places through story, preserve traces of that movement. Some describe drowned lands and lost hunting grounds, accurately matching modern reconstructions of paleocoasts now beneath the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Timor Sea. At Marawah, the archaeology connects directly to those oral histories. The people who once lived on the drowned shelf are ancestors of the Ngaluma Yinjibarndi, the Yaburara Mardudunera, and other groups still present in the region. The heritage is carved into the rocks above water and scattered beneath it. The underwater finds extend that timeline back into a period when the coast lay far to the northwest, showing that Aboriginal occupation adapted continuously to dramatic environmental change. Underwater mapping of the shelf has revealed more potential sites: ancient river channels, terraces and lagoons now 10 to 20 metres deep. At Flying Foam Passage and other parts of the Dampier archipelago, sonar imagery shows possible hearthstones and concentrations of lithic debris. Each may represent another pocket of the lost Ice Age landscape. Exploration is slow and delicate. Divers work carefully to document context before currents shift sediment. Every object recovered is recorded, 3D scanned, and returned to the seabed according to heritage protocols developed with indigenous custodians. Environmental data from core samples deepen the picture. Beneath layers of marine sand lie preserved soils with pollen from grassland and eucalyptus, remnants of a terrestrial ecosystem now far offshore. Microfossils indicate freshwater conditions until around 8,000 years ago, when saltwater finally overwhelmed the area. The geological record mirrors human experience: gradual encroachment, then irreversible change. Viewed through the catastrophe lens, the submerged sites along the Australian shelf are not ruins of sudden destruction, but archives of adaptation. They show how early peoples responded to sea level rise by shifting economies, changing toolkits, and remapping their world. The transition from hunter-gatherer territories on the shelf to coastal fishing and shellfish gathering on the new shorelines can be traced in the archaeological sequence. On land, the oldest rock art fades just above today's high tide mark. Below it, the story continues underwater. Page-Ladson, Florida, around 14,550 BP. In the quiet bend of the Orcilla River, where cypress roots knot the water and the light filters through Spanish moss, lies one of the oldest archaeological sites in North America, Page-Ladson. To anyone paddling past today, it looks like an ordinary stretch of dark river, but beneath the current, buried under meters of sediment, rests a time capsule from nearly 15,000 years ago, when the first known people of Florida stood on dry ground hunting mastodons. The discovery story began in the 1980s, when divers exploring sinkholes in the river noticed bones protruding from the limestone walls. The Orcilla's bottom was a labyrinth of springs and sinkholes, many filled with silt and ancient remains. Among them, one sinkhole, later named Page-Ladson after the landowners, revealed layers of fossil bone and stone artifacts preserved in the still, oxygen-poor water. For decades, archaeologists returned here with scuba gear, working by feel in the dark, cutting through centuries of mud. The first entry in the dig diary came from 1983. Bone, mastodon, possible cut marks. The team had found tusks and limb bones belonging to an extinct Ice Age mastodon. What caught their attention was a deep, parallel groove etched into one rib. Under magnification, it matched the kind of slicing left by a stone knife. The context was clear: a natural, undisturbed layer, 8 meters below the modern riverbed. But at the time, many researchers doubted that humans had reached Florida so early. The dominant theory held that the first Americans, the Clovis culture, arrived around 13,000 years ago. Anything older was controversial. Still, excavation continued. Divers carefully vacuumed sediment through hoses to the surface, filtering every handful for bone and stone. They mapped each find in 3 dimensions, working blind under murky water. Over the years, hundreds of animal bones emerged: mastodon, horse, camel, bison, and giant tortoise. Mixed among them were flakes of chert, the sharp-edged byproducts of toolmaking, and a single intact knife-like biface. The stratigraphy showed these artifacts resting directly beside mastodon remains dated to about 14,550 years before present. It was clear evidence that people and megafauna had coexisted here long before the Clovis period. In the notes of the 2016 re-excavation led by Jesse Halligan and colleagues, the diary describes the work in meticulous detail. Divers entered the Orcilla each morning, descending through 7 meters of tannin-stained water. Visibility was near zero. They navigated by rope and memory, brushing sediment away with gloved hands. Every bone was tagged underwater and photographed in place before removal. Sediments were sampled for pollen, charcoal, and microscopic plant remains to reconstruct the environment. What they found revealed a late Pleistocene landscape unlike modern Florida, a cooler, drier plain crossed by rivers and dotted with wetlands, home to mastodons and now extinct grazing species. The 2016 study confirmed what earlier generations had only suspected. The cut-marked bones were authentic evidence of human activity. The marks were microscopic V-shaped grooves produced by stone tools, not by trampling or river erosion. Radiocarbon dating of associated organic material placed them firmly at 14,550 years ago, at least 1,000 years before Clovis technology appeared elsewhere. The team's field logs record excitement but also restraint. Every claim had to be verified, every layer rechecked. The river's slow flow had sealed these deposits in anaerobic silt, preserving them as if locked in time. As the dig diary transitions into the catastrophe lens, the story shifts from discovery to disappearance. When these people camped along the Orcilla, the river cut through a broad savanna. The sea lay far to the west. Florida's coastline extended nearly 100 kilometers farther than today. But as the Ice Age ended, melting glaciers raised global sea levels, water tables rose, and the Orcilla's valley began to flood. Over the next several millennia, the mastodon hunting ground sank beneath layers of silt, sand, and finally the river itself. What had once been an open bank became a submerged archive. The flood was not a single event but a slow drowning. Generation by generation, the groundwater crept higher until the old river terrace vanished. The campfires went out, the bones settled, and sediment sealed them away. When modern divers reached the layer, it was as if they were touching a moment frozen mid-action. Tools beside bones beside river mud that once held footprints. Environmental data from the site track this transformation. Sediment cores show a shift from dry grassland pollen, oak and pine, to aquatic species such as water lily and cypress, evidence of rising water. The mastodons disappeared soon after, their extinction part of the broader die-off of Ice Age megafauna. The people, however, remained in the region, adapting to wetlands and rivers, leaving later camps on higher ground that would become the known archaic sites of Florida. The catastrophe of inundation erased the old landscape but preserved its record beneath the mud. At Page-Ladson, every layer tells a stage in that process. The lowest sediments hold bones from mastodon herds visiting waterholes during drought. Above them lie the cut-marked remains and stone tools, a brief human presence recorded in centimetres of clay. Higher still are layers of fine silt deposited after flooding began, followed by sand and organic muck from the modern river. Each stratum represents a changing world, from dry plain to swamp to submerged channel. In 2016, the recovered artifacts were cleaned, catalogued, and compared with tool types from elsewhere. The shapes were simple: flakes, scrapers, and a biface, but the technology fit early human adaptation to local stone. The knife that had sliced the mastodon rib may have been held by one of the earliest inhabitants of the American Southeast. Chemical analysis of nearby plant remains revealed freshwater algae and charred seeds, suggesting that small fires once burned near the riverbank, perhaps for cooking meat or warding off insects. The catastrophe lens widens again to take in the global scene. Around the same time, other submerged landscapes were forming: Doggerland in the North Sea, the Persian Gulf Oasis, the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia. Rising seas were transforming continents, turning valleys into bays and riverbeds into seafloors. Page-Ladson is one of these front lines of change, where archaeology meets geology and time collapses underwater. Monte Verde, Chile, around 14,550 to 14,500 BP. In the cool, wet lowlands of southern Chile, where mist drifts through forests of beech and bamboo, a small creek called Chinchihuapi winds between peat bogs. On its banks lies one of the most important archaeological sites in the Americas, Monte Verde. Today the ground is waterlogged and silent, but beneath the turf preserved by the same peat and moisture lies a frozen moment from nearly 15,000 years ago. The story began in the late 1970s when a young Chilean archaeologist, Tom Dillahay, was called to examine bones eroding from the banks. Local workers had found what looked like mastodon remains. When excavations began, they uncovered not just bones but wooden stakes, hearths, and fragments of hide and plant fibre, all sealed beneath layers of clay and peat. The anaerobic soil had trapped everything: wood, seeds, meat, and even footprints. What emerged was a campsite so well preserved that it rewrote the timeline of human arrival in the Americas. The first entry in the evidence ledger records the setting. 15,000 years ago, the region around Monte Verde was a cool, open valley dotted with ponds and streams. Conifers, grasses, and shrubs grew along the slopes, and large animals, mastodon, horse, and ancient llama, roamed the plains. The Pacific coast lay only about 80 kilometers to the west, connected by rivers running down from the Andes. The climate was cold but stable, the soil rich, and fresh water abundant. It was a place where people could stop, build shelters, and live for weeks at a time. The second entry describes the settlement remains, excavations revealed two adjacent areas. The larger, MV2, contained at least a dozen small dwellings made of wood and hide, arranged along a central walkway of logs and planks. Each hut had its own hearth lined with stones and clay, filled with charcoal and burnt bones. Posts and ropes had once held up walls of animal hide stretched over a framework of poles. The walkway, still visible as a row of logs preserved in peat, ran parallel to the creek, a natural corridor through the landscape. Radiocarbon dates from the hearths and burned wood centred around 14,550 years BP, older than any confirmed Clovis site. Inside the shelters, the artefacts formed another layer of the ledger. Stone tools were small and simple, flakes, scrapers and pebble choppers made from local river cobbles. There were no fluted Clovis-style points, only expedient tools suited to cutting meat, working wood and scraping hides. Beside them lay fragments of bone points and digging sticks carved from wood. The scarcity of heavy hunting weapons suggested that the inhabitants used traps, spears, or cooperative drives rather than single-handed pursuits. The tools showed wear from multiple activities: butchering, woodworking and plant processing, marking a versatile toolkit for a mobile group. One of the most extraordinary entries lists organic materials rarely preserved elsewhere. In the hearths, archaeologists found remains of mastodon meat, still fibrous and red under the microscope. Nearby, bundles of wild potatoes, edible seeds and berries were stored inside knotted bags of plant fibre. More than 70 species of plants were identified, including many from coastal or upland environments tens of kilometres away. Among them were seaweed and kelp, unmistakably marine. Their presence proved that the people of Monte Verde had contact with the Pacific coast and carried food inland. The mix of resources showed broad ecological knowledge. Forest, steppe, river and sea linked together in a single subsistence network. The ledger also records evidence of construction and technology. Wooden planks and stakes were shaped with stone tools. Some still bore cut marks and notches for joining. Cords twisted from reeds tied parts of the structures together. Fragments of woven mats and nets indicate weaving technology already in use. One section of the site revealed large logs arranged as platforms, perhaps for drying meat or storing goods above damp ground. The workmanship implied long familiarity with timber and fibre, materials almost never preserved at other early sites. Another section of the ledger lists faunal remains. Alongside mastodon bones were those of camelids, foxes, birds, and small rodents. Cut marks on many of them show deliberate butchering. Fish bones from freshwater species add to the evidence of diverse food sources. Burned fragments of animal hide suggest that skin was used for clothing or shelter. The density of remains around hearths implies repeated occupation, not a single stop, but a return point along seasonal routes. Microscopic study of the sediments added yet another layer: footprints and impressions. In one area, overlapping prints pressed into clay record the passage of both humans and animals. The human prints are small, likely those of children, suggesting family groups rather than hunting parties. Their presence gives texture to the site: people living, cooking, and moving within a cluster of shelters along the creek. The next entries track environmental change and preservation. Soon after the camp was abandoned, the stream flooded, covering the area with fine silt. Peat then accumulated, sealing the organic materials from oxygen. This natural burial preserved the fragile wooden structures for millennia. Later, as glaciers melted and rainfall increased, the water table rose, turning the valley into a bog. The flooding that buried Monte Verde became the reason it survived. In the botanical section, researchers identified remains of medicinal and aromatic plants such as boldo and canelo, both used by modern indigenous peoples of the region. Their presence hints at an early understanding of local flora beyond simple nutrition. Pieces of chewed seaweed and woody stems show tooth impressions, direct evidence of people processing or consuming these plants. The evidence ledger also includes spatial organisation. Each dwelling had a distinct set of activities, one rich in plant remains, another in stone flakes, a third with animal bones and ash. This distribution suggests task specialisation within the camp. Along the walkway, pits lined with clay may have stored food or tools. A concentration of red ochre fragments indicates pigment use, perhaps for body paint or treating hides. The uppermost layers of sediment tell of the catastrophe that finally hid the site. Rising meltwater from retreating Andean glaciers swelled the rivers. Floods deposited thick layers of clay, changing the course of the Chinchihuapi Creek and covering the settlement. As centuries passed, peat moss colonized the surface, sealing it beneath a meter of wet soil. The wooden planks, plant bundles and tools remained intact in the dark, oxygen-free ground. When excavators uncovered them 10 millennia later, the peat still smelled faintly of resin and smoke. The artifacts lay as they had been left, logs aligned, tools beside hearths, footprints pressed in clay. Every item entered into the evidence ledger of Monte Verde tells of a people who thrived in southern Chile long before glaciers fully withdrew, living between forest and coast, their world preserved in mud and water at the end of the Ice Age. What they left behind is all that remains of the first chapters of our story: stone, bone, wood, and silent ground. The floods erased their villages, but not their memory. Each buried wall, each tool, each carving reminds us that long before history began, they were already here.